Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that's both tender and thought-provoking.
The long, often overlooked history of people born with Down syndrome, from ancient societies where their presence was misunderstood, to more recent decades of stigma, progress, and advocacy. This journey reveals not only how far we've come, but how much further we still need to go to ensure every life is seen as valuable and full of potential. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here.
And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you.
It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world.
Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.
Long before there were textbooks, hospitals, or genetic science, there were only human eyes, watching, wondering, interpreting the world through myth, emotion, and instinct.
In this distant past, the arrival of a child who looked or behaved differently evoked deep, often spiritual reactions.
We don't have written accounts from these ancient times describing what we now call Down syndrome.
But archaeology gives us rare, moving glimpses. In 2014, a team of researchers in France uncovered a 150-year-old burial site. Among the remains was a young child with distinct cranial features, matching those of Down syndrome. This child, despite their differences, was buried with care, not cast out or discarded, but laid gently to rest in the same sacred manner as others in the community.
It's a small detail, but a powerful one. What it suggests is that long before medical terms were invented, some people responded not with fear, but with acceptance. In a world without diagnoses, perhaps this child was simply seen as a quieter soul.
Maybe they were carried more often, spoken to more softly. Maybe they were loved, not in spite of their differences, but because of them.
In other ancient cultures, physical and intellectual differences were often interpreted through a spiritual lens. Some were revered as having a special connection to the divine.
Others, sadly, were misunderstood, feared, or shunned.
Without a framework to understand conditions like Down syndrome, the reaction largely depended on the culture, the time, and the temperament of the surrounding people. The fact that we've found more than one ancient burial like this, including possible cases in ancient Rome and the Andes, tells us something quietly profound. People with Down syndrome have always been part of the human family.
Always. Their presence is not a modern phenomenon. It is not a flaw to be corrected or a problem to be solved.
It is part of the natural diversity of life, a thread woven into the human story since the beginning. These ancient burials whisper to us across time.
They say, I was here.
I mattered.
I was not forgotten.
And as we journey deeper into history, we'll see how that whisper was sometimes drowned out and how it slowly found its voice again. As we step into the classical world, ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, India, and beyond, we enter civilizations rich with myth, philosophy, and symbolism.
In these societies, difference wasn't always interpreted medically.
Instead, it was often understood through metaphor, religion, and mystery.
People who looked or acted differently were often cast in symbolic roles.
Some were seen as touched by the gods, vessels of divine will, omens, or cosmic messengers.
Others were viewed with suspicion, seen as signs of imbalance, impurity, or ancestral sin. In either case, individuals with cognitive or physical differences were rarely just people. They were symbols. They were riddles wrapped in skin and bone.
Let us drift for a moment to the humid, dense jungles of ancient Mesoamerica, to the land of the Olmecs.
This was a civilization that thrived more than 3,000 years ago, long before the Aztecs or the Maya rose to power.
The Olmecs were master carvers.
They left behind colossal stone heads, heavy and silent, staring out from the rainforest floor.
But they also left behind smaller figurines, carved from jade and serpentine.
Art historians and archaeologists have long been puzzled by a recurring motif in Olmec art.
They call it the Wajagur. These figures depict humans, often infants, with very specific facial characteristics.
Downturned mouths, almond-shaped eyes that tilt upwards, a flatter nasal bridge. For decades, the prevailing theory was that these were mythological hybrids, a blend of human and jaguar, representing a powerful spiritual transformation.
But in more recent years, a quieter, more grounded theory has emerged. Some medical anthropologists have looked at these jade figures and seen not a jaguar but a person. They suggest that the Olmecs were depicting individuals with Down syndrome.
And if this is true, it changes everything about how we view their place in that ancient world.
In Olmec culture,
The jaguar was the most powerful, most sacred animal.
It was the ruler of the night, the master of the jungle. If people with Down syndrome were associated with the jaguar, it implies a reverence that is almost impossible for us to fully grasp today. It suggests that their difference was seen as a mark of power, perhaps a sign that they existed halfway between the physical world and the spirit world.
Imagine a child born in a village deep in the rainforest in 1000 BC. Instead of being hidden away, their features are recognized as the mark of the jaguar. They are perhaps treated with a mixture of awe and gentle caution.
They are seen as beings who vibrate at a different frequency, closer to the earth, closer to the gods.
It is a beautiful possibility to consider that in the deep past, what we now call a disability might have been seen as a super ability, a heightened state of being. Now, let the scene dissolve.
Let the green jungle fade into the golden sands of ancient Egypt. Here, the pantheon of gods is vast and complex. Animal-headed deities rule the sky and the underworld. But there is one god who stands apart. He does not have the head of a hawk or a jackal. He is entirely human, yet distinct. His name is Bes. Bes was the protector of households, mothers, and children. He was the defender of sleep.
When you closed your eyes in ancient Egypt, it was Bes who watched over you, scaring away the bad dreams and the night spirits.
And when we look at statues of Bes, we see a figure with dwarfism, but also with features that some modern geneticists have compared to those associated with chromosomal differences. While Bes is a god, his existence in the cultural imagination of Egypt tells us something about how the Egyptians viewed physical difference. It was not something to be feared.
It was something that could protect you. It was something that held power. We know from records that people with dwarfism and other physical differences held high positions in the Egyptian court.
They were jewelry makers, keepers of the royal wardrobe, and entertainers who were deeply respected. While we don't have a specific papyrus that describes Down syndrome with clinical accuracy, the spirit of the culture suggests a certain integration.
The ancient Egyptians believed that the body was a vessel, but the spirit, was eternal.
If the vessel was shaped differently, the car inside was no less divine. But history is not a straight line of progress or kindness.
It is a winding river, with dark, cold eddies. As we move from the ancient world into the Middle Ages in Europe, the light changes.
The sun sets on the pagan gods, and a new theological order takes hold. The forests of Europe are thick and dark, and the minds of the people are filled with superstitions that sit uncomfortably alongside their faith. In this era, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, life was fragile.
Infant mortality was high.
A healthy child was a blessing. A sickly or different child was a source of immense anxiety. And it is here, in the shadow of the medieval hearth, that we encounter the myth of the changeling. This is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking chapters in our story. The changeling folklore was prevalent across Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, and Germany. The story went like this. The fairies, or the hidden people, coveted beautiful human babies.
They would creep into the house at night while the mother slept and steal the healthy human child. In its place, they would leave one of their own an old, withered fairy or a sickly elf child.
This changeling would not grow like other children.
It might be quieter, or perhaps it cried incessantly. It might have features that looked a little different: slanted eyes, a protruding tongue, a softness to the muscles.
It might take longer to walk or to speak. For a long time, historians and folklorists have agreed that the changeling myth was, in many ways, a purely scientific explanation for conditions like Down syndrome, autism, and failure to thrive.
Try to put yourself in the shoes of a medieval peasant. You work the land from dawn till dusk.
You have no understanding of genetics, no concept of chromosomes. You only know the stories your grandmother told you.
You have a baby who seems perfect at birth, but as the months go by, you notice they are different. They are floppy. They don't sit up when the other babies do. They smile a beat later than expected.
The changeling myth offered an explanation.
It wasn't that your child was sick.
It was that this wasn't your child. Your real child was living with the fairies in a hill somewhere, dancing and eating honey. This child in the cradle was an imposter.
This belief led to complicated, often tragic treatments. Some parents treated the changeling with caution, hoping that if they made the fairy child uncomfortable enough, the fairies would come back and swap them again. But others simply loved the child they had, regardless of the story.
There are records, court rolls, and parish registers that hint at the lives of these natural fools, as they were sometimes called in later medieval law. The term fool sounds harsh to our modern ears, dripping with insult.
but in the legal language of the time, a natural fool was someone who was innocent.
They were legally protected by the king because they were considered incapable of malice. They were seen as being in a state of perpetual childhood. In a world that was often brutal and violent, being incapable of malice was a rare and saintly quality.
Some theologians argued that because these individuals could not understand the complexity of sin, they were automatically guaranteed a place in heaven. They were innocents. They were closer to God than the bishops and the knights, because their souls remained unblemished by the corruptions of the world.
So, even in the Dark Ages, there was a flicker of light, a recognition that intelligence was not the only measure of a human being. Purity of heart mattered. Simplicity mattered.
As the Middle Ages began to wane, and the first light of the Renaissance touched the spires of Europe, art began to change. We started to see a shift from the symbolic to the realistic.
Painters wanted to capture the world as it truly was, in all its variety.
And it is here, in the 15th century, that we find one of the most striking pieces of visual evidence in our history. We travel to Mantua, Italy. The year is roughly 1460. The artist is Andrea Mantegna, a master of perspective and detail.
He is painting a scene that has been painted thousands of times, the Virgin Mary and the Christ Child. But look closely at the painting titled The Virgin and Child, or sometimes the Madonna and Child with Saints. Look at the face of the infant Jesus.
And look at the face of the toddler standing beside him, often identified as John the Baptist. The features are undeniable to the modern eye. The spacing of the eyes, the shape of the orbits, the bridge of the nose, the open mouth, the specific curvature of the fingers. Many medical experts who have analyzed Mantegna's work are convinced that he used a child with Down syndrome as his model for the Christ child. Think about the implications of that. This was the holiest figure in the Christian world, the Son of God, and Mantegna, commissioned by powerful and wealthy patrons, chose a child with Down syndrome to represent divine perfection.
He did not hide the features. He did not correct them to fit the standard beauty ideals of the time.
He painted the child as he was. This suggests that, to Mantegna, and perhaps to his patrons, this face was not deformed, it was not a changeling. It was beautiful. It was worthy of worship. It was the face of God.
There is another painting from this era, a Flemish masterpiece simply called The Adoration of the Christ Child. In the background, mingling with the shepherds and the angels, is a figure who looks remarkably like a person with Down syndrome. They are included in the scene, part of the miracle, standing shoulder to shoulder with the divine. These paintings are like Polaroids from the past. They freeze a moment in time where we can see that exclusion was not the only option. Inclusion was there, hanging on the walls of cathedrals and palaces.
The quiet dignity of the condition was preserved in oil and canvas, waiting for us to notice it 500 years later.
But as the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, the world began to classify, to measure, and to label.
Science began to wake up.
And while science brought miracles of medicine, it also brought a desire to categorize humanity into normal and abnormal. The mystery of the changeling and the divinity of the innocent began to fade, replaced by the cold scrutiny of the medical gaze. We are approaching the 19th century now. The era of the asylum is looming on the horizon.
The era of the diagnosis. This transition is where our story takes a turn from the spiritual to the clinical.
It is a time when the soft-spoken nature of our history becomes harder to hear over the scratching of pens in medical journals and the turning of heavy iron keys in lock. But before we walk down those sterile hallways, let's pause here for a moment. Let's rest in the lingering warmth of the Renaissance light. Let's hold onto that image of the Mantegna painting the infant with the almond eyes, held securely in his mother's arms, looked upon with infinite love.
This is the foundation we need to remember.
That beneath the layers of later stigma, beneath the heavy words that would soon be invented, there was this.
There was simply a child who was part of the fabric of life. Take a deep breath. Feel the stillness of the room around you. The history of Down syndrome is a long tapestry, and we have only just examined the first few threads. In the next part of our journey, we will travel to Victorian England.
We will meet a man named John Langdon Down.
We will walk through the gates of the Earlswood Asylum, and we will see how a condition that had existed for millennia finally got its name, and how that name carried with it a complex legacy of racial theory and misunderstanding that would take a century to unravel.
But for now, let the ancient world rest.
Let the Olmec jaguars sleep in the stone. Let the changelings return to the safety of the folklore.
And let yourself drift knowing that, even in the forgotten corners of history, love has always found a way to exist.
Imagine the sound of rain on cobblestones, the distant rhythmic clatter of carriage wheels.
The air is thicker now, filled with the smoke of industry and the heavy scent of coal.
This is an age of obsession with order.
It is an age where humanity felt a sudden, intense need to catalogue everything.
Plants, animals, rocks, stars.
And people, science was rising.
The telescope and the microscope were the new tools of truth. And in this world of categorization, the changeling of the medieval forest could no longer just be a mystery. It had to be a medical subject. It had to have a name.
Our journey takes us to the rolling hills of Surrey, England, in the year 1858. We are walking up a long, gravel driveway toward a massive building.
This is the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots.
The name sounds harsh to us now, abrasive and cruel.
But in the mid-19th century, these words were clinical terms, not insults.
Earlswood was intended to be a place of refuge, a noble institution funded by charity, designed to care for those whom society didn't know how to handle. Inside these walls, we meet a young doctor.
He is 30 years old, with a kind face and bushy Victorian sideburns. His name is John Langdon Down. John Langdon Down was a man of paradoxes. He was a scientist, rigorous and observant, but he was also a liberal, a progressive for his time, a man who believed in the dignity of his patients.
When he arrived at Earlswood as the medical superintendent, he didn't just see a mass of incurables. He saw individuals.
And he began to look closer than anyone had looked before. Imagine him walking the corridors of the asylum, the gas lamps flickering on the walls, casting long shadows.
He carries a notebook, the pages thick and cream-colored, his fountain pen scratching softly as he makes notes.
He observes the patients as they eat, as they work in the gardens, as they sit by the windows watching the English rain.
He begins to notice a specific group of patients. They are unrelated by blood. They come from different families, different social classes.
Some are the children of wealthy merchants, others are the children of labourers, and yet Dr. Down notices a striking familial resemblance between them. He writes about the shape of their eyes, the smallness of their noses, the texture of their skin, which he describes as soft and velvety.
He notes their temperament, how they seem to possess a natural sense of rhythm, a love for mimicry, and a generally humorous and affectionate nature. He is puzzled. How can these unrelated people look so much like siblings?
Dr. Down was working under the scientific frameworks of his time,
and the dominant framework of the 1860s was anthropology and racial theory. Scientists were obsessed with classifying the races of mankind.
And so, when John Langdon Down looked at these patients, he tried to fit them into the only map of humanity he had. In 1866, he published a paper. It was a short paper, only a few pages long, but it would change the world for these individuals for the next 100 years. He titled it Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots. In this paper, he argued that these patients represented a regression to a different racial type.
Because of the epicanthic fold of the eye, that distinct, beautiful almond shape, he believed they looked like the people of Mongolia.
And so, he coined the term Mongoloid. It was a mistake.
A massive scientific error born of the prejudices and limitations of Victorian thought.
He was wrong about the cause. He was wrong about the racial connection. But, in his own way, he was trying to say something radical. He was asserting that these individuals were part of the human family.
You see, at the time, some people believed that those with intellectual disabilities were a different species entirely, or accidents of nature. By classifying them as a racial type, Down was arguing that they were fully human, just a different variety of human.
It was a clumsy, incorrect attempt at inclusion, wrapped in the bias of the era. But let's step away from the paper and the theory. Let's look at the man's heart.
Because while history often remembers Langdon Down for the incorrect name he gave the condition, it often forgets how he actually treated the people. After 10 years at Earlswood, John Langdon Down did something extraordinary.
He left the large, cold institution. He wanted to create something better.
A place that felt less like a hospital and more like a home. In 1868, he and his wife, Mary, a woman who is the unsung hero of this story, opened their own private home in Teddington. They called it Normansfield. Close your eyes and try to picture Normansfield.
It is not a grim asylum.
It is a grand Victorian house surrounded by ancient trees, green lawns and flower gardens. It is quiet here.
There smells of lavender and beeswax.
At Normansfield, the philosophy was different.
Dr. Down and Mary believed in what they called moral treatment. They believed that people with Down syndrome, though they didn't use that name yet, were sensitive, cultured souls who needed beauty to thrive. They didn't just warehouse people.
They educated them. Imagine the dining room at Nomansfield. It is set with fine china, silver cutlery, and crisp white linens.
The patients were taught strict table manners. They dressed in the finest fashions of the day: waistcoats, silk dresses, ribbons. Dignity was the rule. But the heart of Nomansfield was the theatre. Dr. Down believed that training of the dramatic faculty was essential. He built a magnificent gilded theatre right inside the hospital.
It is still there today, a hidden jewel of Victorian architecture.
It has painted scenery, velvet curtains, and intricate acoustics. Every week, the residents of Nomansfield would put on plays and operettas. Imagine the scene. The lights go down, the heavy velvet curtain rises.
And there on stage are the patients.
They are singing.
They are reciting lines.
They are dancing. For a moment, they are not patients. They are not mongoloids. They are actors. They are artists. Dr. Down observed that his patients had a remarkable sense of timing and a deep love for music.
He saw that they flourished when they were given a role to play, when they were applauded, when they were seen.
There is a beautiful description from this era of the daily life at Nomansfield.
It speaks of long walks in the countryside, of lessons in embroidery and woodworking, of reading groups. It was a bubble of safety, a place where the soft-spoken nature of the condition was met with a soft-spoken environment. However, we must be honest with the history.
Nomansfield was a paradise, but it was a paradise for the wealthy. It was a private institution. The families who sent their children there paid a premium for this care. For the poor, for the working class of London's East End or the industrial North, the reality was much starker.
If you had a child with Down syndrome in a poor family in 1880, your options were limited.
You likely kept them at home, hidden away in a back room, safe from the mocking eyes of the street urchins. Or, if you could not feed them, you surrendered them to the workhouse, the Victorian workhouse.
The very word carries a chill. These were places of hard labour and destitution.
But for those with intellectual disabilities, there was often no labour they could do that satisfied the masters. So they sat.
They sat in courtyards with high walls. They wore rough wool uniforms that scratched the skin.
They ate gruel and stale bread. They were lumped together with the insane, the criminal, and the sick in these dark corners. The tenderness we saw at Nomansfield was absent. Here, the Mongoloid label became a stamp of uselessness.
They were seen as a drain on the empire. Yet, even here, in the bleakest of places, there were moments of humanity. Archives from the time sometimes reveal letters from workhouse nurses, or notes in the margins of ledgers, describing a particular fondness for a child with Down syndrome.
They were often the favourites of the staff. Their smiles, open and genuine, cut through the gloom of the institution. Even in the workhouse, their light could not be entirely extinguished.
As the 19th century drew to a close, John Langdon Down passed away in 1896.
He left behind a complicated legacy. He had given the condition a name, but it was a name that tied it to race, a connection that would confuse medicine for decades.
He had created a sanctuary at Nomansfield, proving that with kindness and education, these individuals could learn, create, and live happy lives. But he had also unwittingly set the stage for the era of eugenics.
The sun is setting on the Victorian era now. Queen Victoria dies in 1901. The gas lamps are being replaced by electric bulbs.
The world is speeding up.
Cars are appearing on the streets.
The quiet, slow pace that suited people with Down syndrome so well is disappearing, and a new science is rising. A science that is cold, mathematical, and ruthless.
It is called eugenics. The early 20th century brings with it a dark shadow. The innocent fools of the Middle Ages, the exotic curiosities of the Victorian era, are about to be rebranded again. This time, they will be called a menace. It is hard to believe, listening to this now, in the safety of your room, that the world could turn so coldly against such gentle people. But it is important that we look at this darkness,
because it is in the darkness that the resilience of the human spirit shines the brightest. We are standing on the precipice of the 1920s and 32nd.
The medical books are being rewritten.
The tone is no longer one of curiosity, but of elimination.
The goal is no longer to care, but to cure society of them. But that is a heavy door to open, and we must open it slowly. For now, let us stay for one last moment in the gardens of Nomansfield.
It is a summer evening in 1890.
The crickets are singing in the tall grass.
A group of residents is sitting on the lawn, listening to a woman read a story aloud.
The sun is dipping below the horizon. painting the sky in shades of violet and rose. One of the residents, a young man with a gentle smile, leans back against an oak tree and closes his eyes.
He is safe here.
He is fed.
He is dressed in warm clothes.
He has spent the day painting in the studio.
He does not know about chromosomes. He does not know about the workhouses. He only knows the sound of the reader's voice, the smell of the grass, and the feeling of peace. Hold onto this image.
This peace, because the storm is coming. In the next part of our journey, we will walk through that storm. We will explore the rise of the eugenics movement in America and Europe. We will look at the heartbreaking era of institutionalization in the mid-20th century.
But we will also see the first stirrings of the parents' movement and mothers and fathers who refused to accept the world's judgment of their children. The silence of the forgotten lives is about to be broken by the first whispers of a roar. But for tonight, the theatre curtain at Normansfield is down.
The gaslights are dimmed. The script is resting on the table.
We have arrived at the beginning of the 20th century.
The world is vibrant with new technology, but beneath the excitement of electric lights and motor cars, a cold, hard logic is taking root.
The era of kindness, like that scene at Normansfield, is fading, replaced by the grim calculation of efficiency. If the Victorian era was about classification, the early 20th century was about control. Walk with me now quietly into the shadow of a new scientific theory, eugenics.
The word itself, eugenics, means will born on the surface. It sounded hopeful to many people at the time, the idea that humanity could guide its own evolution, ensuring health and strength for future generations. But its implementation was tragically flawed and deeply cruel. It was rooted in fear, the fear of social decay, the fear of the unfit dragging down the progress of society. In the United States, in Britain, and across Scandinavia and Germany, prominent scientists, politicians, and social reformers embraced this movement. They created vast, intricate family trees, searching for signs of what they called effectiveness, and those categorized as feeble-minded, which included people with Down syndrome, were tragically placed near the top of the list for elimination. The prevailing logic was simple, mathematical, and heartless. If a person with an intellectual disability cost the state money, and if they were deemed unlikely to contribute labor, then society was better off without them.
They were no longer seen as an innocent in God's eyes or a cherished resident of a gentle home. They were now a line item on a government ledger.
This belief system led to the construction of massive, sprawling institutions.
They were built far away from the cities, isolated in rural fields, out of sight and out of mind. They were given cold, official names, state schools, training centers, colonies, asylums. Imagine one of these state hospitals in the American Midwest or the British countryside, sometime around 1935.
The buildings are huge, made of grey concrete or uniform brick.
They are designed for function, not feeling.
The windows are tall and narrow, like silent, judging eyes. The whole atmosphere whispers of regulation and isolation.
As you walk through the doors, you are met with a sterile smell, a mix of bleach, institutional food, and stale air.
The halls are long, echoing tunnels. The sound of a footstep travels too far, making quiet conversation almost impossible. This lack of sound privacy was often a deep discomfort for the residents. The residents themselves wore identical, rough cotton clothing. Their identities were stripped away, replaced by a file number, a bed number, and a diagnosis.
For a person with Down syndrome, who thrives on connection, personalized attention, and sensory richness, this environment was profoundly damaging.
It was the coldest winter of their history.
Doctors and administrators of the time often recommended what they called immediate institutionalization. When a baby was born with Down syndrome, the doctor would advise the parents, take it home for a few days, say goodbye, and then place it in the state school.
Forget the child. It will be better for your family, and better for society. This advice, given with a professional certainty, devastated families.
Many parents, pressured by physicians and ashamed by societal stigma, handed over their babies, believing they were doing the only thing possible. They would spend the rest of their lives consumed by grief and guilt.
These children became the true forgotten lives. They were cut out of family photos, erased from conversations, locked behind the heavy wooden doors of the asylum. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that these institutions rarely offered any meaningful care. They offered custodial care. The staff-to-resident ratios were abysmal.
One nurse might be responsible for 30 or 40 residents. There was no time for the individualized education or the theatre programs that Dr. Down cherished.
Life inside became a monotonous routine, waking, eating gruel, sitting, waiting. The sensory environment of these places often caused regression. People who had learned to talk began to lose their words. People who could walk sometimes sat down and stayed there. The lack of stimulation, the emotional coldness, suppressed the inherent potential of every resident. Yet even in this bleak landscape, the light of human connection could not be entirely extinguished. Imagine a small, quiet corner in one of these massive halls. Perhaps a young resident with Down syndrome sits on the floor, gently sorting buttons or stringing beads. A nurse, overworked and exhausted, pauses for a moment. She sits down, not because she has to, but because she needs a minute of peace. The resident looks up and offers a slow, genuine smile. In the official records, this resident is a defective, but in that brief, silent exchange, the nurse sees something entirely different. A warmth, a purity of intention, a soul that is completely present. In these quiet, unwritten moments, a shared cup of tea, a gentle touch on the shoulder, a whispered bedtime story, the true history of care was preserved. These were the tiny acts of rebellion against the cold logic of eugenics. The eugenics movement found its darkest and most horrifying expression in Nazi Germany, where the lives of people with Down syndrome and other disabilities were targeted for outright destruction under the T for Euthanasia program. But even in democratic nations like the US, compulsory sterilization laws were passed in dozens of states, making it legal to perform forced surgeries on those labeled feeble-minded to prevent them from having children. The fear was that the defect would spread. This fear, of course, was based on profound ignorance. No one yet knew the actual cause of Down syndrome. They were guessing, classifying, and controlling based on observable traits, not scientific truth. The search for the root cause, the biology, had been entirely abandoned in favor of social engineering. As World War II raged and then drew to a close, the era of eugenics began to lose its scientific and moral authority. The world had seen the catastrophic results of using genetic purity as a guiding principle. Slowly, painfully, the focus began to shift from controlling who was born to understanding how people were born. The 1950s arrived with a new sense of purpose. Science was experiencing a post-war boom, and the field of genetics was exploding. Researchers in Paris specifically were starting to use powerful new microscopes to look deep inside the human cell. They weren't interested in the color of the skin or the shape of the eye anymore. They were looking at the internal blueprint of life itself, the chromosomes. This scientific shift was driven not only by curiosity, but by the quiet, tireless efforts of a small group of people, the parents. The mothers and fathers who had been told to forget, their children began to organize. They were tired of the shame. They were tired of the silence. They were tired of the institutions. They started forming small, local parent groups, often meeting in church basements or private living rooms to share information and demand better services. In these quiet, determined meetings, the first seeds of advocacy were planted. The parents were not scientists, but they were observers. They knew their children were loving, capable, and worthy of life. Their collective whisper of defiance would eventually become the civil rights movement for people with disabilities. We are now on the verge of the greatest scientific breakthrough in this history, the discovery that would finally give this condition an accurate, clinical, and race-neutral name. An explanation that would shatter the legacy of John Langdon Down's Mongoloid era. It is 1959. The microscope is ready. The cells are being prepared. Let that excitement sit with you for a moment. The shift from the coldness of the asylum to the bright, focused light of the laboratory. The year is 1959. Our journey takes us not to a grand cathedral or a vast asylum, but to a small, brightly lit laboratory in Paris. The air here is quiet, filled only with the faint hum of specialized equipment and the gentle turning of microscope adjustments. We are looking over the shoulder of a young, brilliant French pediatrician and geneticist named Dr. Jeremy Lejeune. For decades, the cause of Down syndrome had been a mystery. Doctors debated everything from tuberculosis to poor maternal health. John Langdon Down's incorrect racial theory persisted simply because no one had a better, more accurate answer. But in the 1950s, a new understanding of the core building blocks of life was emerging. Scientists had finally figured out how to accurately count and photograph the human chromosomes, those tiny, X-shaped strands of genetic material tucked deep inside every cell's nucleus. These chromosomes are the complete instruction manual, the blueprint for the entire person. The established knowledge was that a healthy human being possesses 46 chromosomes, arranged in 23 pairs.
Dr. Lejeune and his team were painstakingly preparing slides of cells taken from patients with what was still commonly called Mongolism. Imagine the quiet focus in that lab.
A tiny piece of glass, a thin smear of cell culture, a drop of stain to make the invisible visible. Then, the eye pressed to the cool metal of the microscope, carefully counting each strand. One day, one simple, silent count changed everything. They counted 47. They counted again. 47. 46 chromosomes should have been present.
They found one extra.
A small, tiny addition, almost invisible, but profound in its effect.
They traced this extra chromosome to the 21st pair.
Instead of a pair, there were 3. It was named trisomy 21. This single, quiet discovery, published in 1959, was the most significant moment in the history of Down syndrome. It was the scientific equivalent of throwing open a window in a dusty, dark room. The light poured in. The condition was not caused by poor diet or sin or a racial regression. It was not the mother's fault. It was a random, natural, chromosomal difference that occurs at the moment of conception. It was a blueprint with an extra sentence. This realization brought immediate, deep, quiet relief to parents around the world. The shame was lifted. The guilt was refuted. It wasn't something they did. It was simply something that happened. It was biology, not behavior. The discovery also spelled the eventual end of the outdated, inaccurate term Mongolism. Slowly, scientific bodies and medical textbooks began to adopt the simple, descriptive, and accurate title, Down syndrome or Down syndrome, acknowledging Dr. Langdon Down's initial clinical observations. While completely rejecting his flawed ethnic explanation, this new scientific clarity provided the fuel for a revolution already smoldering in the hearts of parents, the parents' movement.
Remember the mothers and fathers we talked about, meeting quietly in their homes and church basements, refusing to forget the children they had been told to abandon. The 1960s saw these small groups fused together into powerful national organizations. Imagine a living room in the suburbs of New York or London in 1965.
The air is thick with coffee and cigarette smoke. The parents are spread out on couches and chairs, passing around pictures of their children. The energy is intense, but the voices are low, determined.
They were sharing tactics. They were comparing notes. They realized that their individual grief was a collective force. Their agenda was simple inclusion. They demanded that their children be taught, not just housed.
They argued that if the children were kept in institutions, the intellectual and developmental deficits they exhibited were not due to trisomy 21, but due to sensory and emotional deprivation.
They realized that the state hospitals were not therapeutic environments.
They were silence chambers. The parents began a long, difficult fight to open the doors of public schools. For decades, children with intellectual disabilities were legally excluded from the public education system. The law said a child must be educable to attend. Parents, armed with the new scientific understanding of trisomy 21, fought back. They argued that every child is educable, just maybe at a different pace, or with a different method. In the United States, this quiet, determined advocacy led to landmark federal legislation. It was a long, complex process involving court cases and lobbying, but the result was revolutionary. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, which later became the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA.
This law was a victory for inclusion.
It mandated that every child, regardless of disability, had the right to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. The old idea of total separation of the asylum was beginning to crumble under the weight of this new legal and moral clarity. Imagine the first days of inclusion. A parent walking their child with Down syndrome, dressed in a new backpack and bright shoes, up the steps of a local public school. It was an act of profound hope and defiance. It was a challenge to decades of segregation. The quiet resilience of these children, often so affectionate and eager to learn, began to break down stereotypes in the classrooms.
Teachers, initially hesitant, quickly discovered that these students brought immense joy, patience, and often a surprising sense of humor to the learning environment. They enriched the classroom, bringing a different kind of human connection that had been missing. Simultaneously, the media began to play a role in dismantling the institutional system.
In the early 1970s, investigative journalists began to expose the truly horrific conditions inside some of the largest state institutions, places like Willowbrook State School in New York. The television images were shocking. Patients neglected, lying unclothed on bare floors, suffering from chronic illness and starvation. This public exposure, seen by millions of Americans, was the final moral blow to the old system of warehousing.
The public saw that the problem was not the people with Down syndrome.
The problem was the institution itself. It was the system that was defective, not the human being. The combination of genetic discovery, trisomy 21, parental advocacy, and public outrage created a powerful, unstoppable force for change.
The long, cold winter of institutional isolation was finally thawing. We enter the 1980s now.
The conversation is no longer about if these individuals should live, but how well they can live. The focus shifts entirely to maximizing potential. Doctors begin to learn about the common health issues associated with Down syndrome, congenital heart defects, thyroid issues, hearing and vision problems, and they develop specialized medical protocols. This medical attention, combined with early intervention programs demanded by the parents, meant that children born in the 1980s began to thrive in ways that were unimaginable to their grandparents. The expected lifespan, which had tragically hovered around the age of 10 in the early 20th century, began to climb dramatically.
It was a testament to the power of love, medical care, and most importantly, seeing the person first. We are leaving the era of the forgotten and entering the era of the fully seen.
The whisper of the forgotten lives is starting to sound like a clear, steady voice in the public square.
We have arrived at the 1980s and the 1990s.
The discovery of trisomy 21 is now secure medical knowledge. Landmark legislation has opened the classroom doors. The mood is no longer defensive.
It is constructive.
The question is no longer what is wrong with them,
but how can we help them reach their potential?
The focus shifted intensely to the very beginning of life, early intervention.
Imagine a small, brightly colored room filled with soft gym mats, simple wooden toys, and a warm, inviting light.
This is an early intervention center. It is designed to be the exact opposite of the cold, sensory-deprived walls of the asylum. We are watching a baby, just a few months old, with Down syndrome. Their muscles are often a little softer, a little slower to engage. A physical therapist is working with them, gently moving their arms and legs in precise, rhythmic patterns. This early, tailored support physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy is the quiet miracle of this era.
It is built on the understanding that the brain, particularly in the first few years, is incredibly adaptable.
If you build the pathways early, if you provide the right sensory input, the possibilities multiply. Imagine the sound of a therapist's soft, encouraging voice, repeating simple sounds to stimulate speech development.
Imagine the texture of Play-Doh or a gentle, vibrating toy, helping a child learn how to process the world through touch.
These small, daily, determined acts unlock developmental milestones that decades of institutionalization had suppressed. The phrase failure to thrive was replaced by pathway to potential. This dedication to early care had a profound, measurable effect, particularly in two key areas: lifespan and learning. First, the longevity leap.
In the 1940s, before the age of inclusion and advanced medicine, the average life expectancy for a person with Down syndrome was tragically low, often less than 10 years.
This was due primarily to health complications, especially congenital heart defects, and the lack of specialized care in institutions. The late 20th century saw the quiet heroics of pediatric cardiologists. Open heart surgery became safer, more common, and more sophisticated.
The once fatal heart conditions were fixed in infancy or early childhood. Suddenly, the biggest medical challenge was solved.
Add to this routine medical screenings for common issues like thyroid disorders, hearing loss, and celiac disease, and the survival rate soared. By the turn of the millennium, the average lifespan for people with Down syndrome had jumped to over 60 years. This was not just a medical statistic.
It was a societal revolution.
It meant that these individuals were now becoming grandmothers and grandfathers. They were full members of the human timeline. Second, the integration of education. The laws passed in the 1970s started bearing fruit in the 1980s. The quiet halls of special education wings became lively with chatter and activity.
Inclusion moved from a legal mandate to a social norm. Children with Down syndrome were now sitting in classrooms alongside their typically developing peers. This benefited everyone.
The students with Down syndrome had strong role models and high expectations. The typically developing students learned compassion, patience, and the fundamental lesson that diversity enriches the community.
The quiet, determined work of the classroom teacher, finding ways to adapt a lesson or provide a simple accommodation, became the cornerstone of this new integrated world. This educational path led inevitably to the next great freedom: independent living and work. The 1990s witnessed the widespread closure of the old state institutions, a process known as deinstitutionalization.
It was a somber process, often marked by the cold, heavy silence of the emptying buildings, but it was an essential step toward freedom. The residents moved out of the massive, echoing hospitals and into small,
supportive group homes nestled quietly in suburban communities. Imagine the simple dignity of having your own room,
your own decorations,
your own favorite chair.
After decades of sharing a large open ward, this personal space was a profound step toward selfhood.
This housing model was paired with supported employment. People with Down syndrome began to take on meaningful jobs in the community in coffee shops, libraries, grocery stores, and offices. Imagine the weight of a paycheck in your hand, the quiet pride of earning your own money,
the simple act of clocking in and out, contributing to the world around you. This provided the self-respect that the Victorian asylum had stolen. Work gave these forgotten lives a purpose and a presence in the daily rhythm of society. This empowerment led to the final, most crucial development of the era: self-advocacy. For centuries, the story of Down syndrome had been told by others, by doctors, priests, parents, and artists. Now, for the first time in history, the people with Down syndrome began to tell their own stories. They formed organizations with names like People First, where they learned how to stand up and speak for their rights, their choices, and their dignity.
Their voices, often soft, sometimes slower, but always fiercely determined, began to be heard in legislative halls and on conference panels.
Imagine listening to a person with Down syndrome address a crowd.
They might be speaking about the right to marry, the right to live where they choose, or simply the right to be treated with respect. Their words, delivered with sincerity and clarity, cut through decades of scientific jargon and medical fear. It taught the world a lesson in perspective, that the most valuable quality is not cognitive speed, but emotional intelligence, compassion, and authentic connection.
As the century drew to a close, the narrative had flipped entirely.
The child born with trisomy 21 was no longer a symbol of tragedy, but a symbol of potential.
They were going to school, falling in love, working, and living alongside everyone else. But the 21st century would bring with it new challenges, fueled by the very technology that brought clarity. The mapping of the human genome and the rise of highly effective prenatal testing would raise deep, difficult ethical questions. Science would offer not only greater help, but also greater choice, a choice that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of medical capability and moral responsibility.
We are standing now in the gentle, supportive light of the year 2000. We have achieved so much, but a final frontier awaits.
A frontier where the quiet, determined voice of the community must be louder than ever. We have moved from the single cell of Dr. Legeune's microscope to the complex landscape of the entire human genome. The genetic map of humanity has been laid bare, and within that map, the blueprint of the 21st chromosome has been studied in molecular detail. This era brings a profound new layer of hope.
Scientists are no longer just identifying trisomy 21. They are looking at the specific genes on their third copy of the chromosome. They are researching which genes are overexpressed, which ones might lead to common occurring conditions like early onset Alzheimer's disease, which affects many adults with Down syndrome.
The hope here is not to cure the condition by removing the chromosome, but to develop targeted therapies to quiet specific overactive genes, to treat health issues before they become debilitating, and to ensure a longer, healthier, more vibrant adulthood.
Imagine the work now taking place in laboratories. It is quiet, meticulous, and focused on the microscopic details of the DNA helix.
The knowledge gained from mapping the genome promises to extend the health span of the generation that, thanks to their parents, already achieved the lifespan revolution.
This is a story of constantly pushing the boundaries of what is possible. However, the 21st century has also ushered in the greatest ethical challenge to the existence of the community: the prenatal frontier.
The development of sophisticated screening tests, particularly non-invasive prenatal testing NIPT, allows prospective parents to know with high accuracy whether their child has trisomy 21, often in the first trimester. This capability has created a profound moment of individual choice, a highly complex and deeply personal ethical space. This is a quiet debate, often held within the confines of a doctor's office or a family's heart, but the collective consequences are immense. We must observe this debate with quiet reverence and neutrality. The technology is simply a mirror, reflecting society's value system. The core of the question is this: is a life with a disability a life worthy of unconditional acceptance? In some countries, the rate of people born with Down syndrome has dropped dramatically.
This has led to a counter-movement by the Down syndrome community itself, a determined, quiet assertion that their lives are not tragedies to be avoided. They are lives full of joy, struggle, connection, and meaning, just like any other.
Imagine the parents of a child with Down syndrome creating a short, beautiful video. They show their child laughing, achieving a milestone, dancing, or comforting a sibling. They post it online, and the message is simple: this is what you might choose away. Look closely at the joy you might miss. This shift from the clinical silence of the past to the visual power of the present is the defining characteristic of this new era. Social media, the ubiquitous digital screen, has become the most powerful tool for dismantling stigma since the parents first gathered in church basements. The advocates of the 1960s had mimeograph newsletters. The advocates of today have the entire world at their fingertips. The forgotten lives are now undeniably visible. Imagine scrolling through your phone and seeing models with Down syndrome gracing high-fashion runways. Or seeing actors with Down syndrome giving powerful, nuanced performances in major motion pictures, earning high praise.
This is not tokenism.
This is representation. Representation matters because it bypasses the outdated textbooks and the fearful language of the past. It shows the world, in a simple, unavoidable image, that people with Down syndrome are complex, attractive, talented, and integral to the human story.
Social platforms have also created unprecedented global support. A new parent in a small town in Australia can instantly connect with a seasoned family in Norway or Argentina.
The shared story, the quiet solidarity, removes the isolation that defined the lives of parents in the Victorian era.
The feeling of being truly alone in the struggle is rapidly disappearing. The modern voice of the community is one of quiet demand, the demand for equity.
While the battles for basic inclusion, like school access, are largely won, the current fight is more subtle. It is the battle against implicit bias in hiring, in housing, and in medical care. It is the fight for the right to age with dignity, ensuring that adults with Down syndrome have access to specialized care as they enter their 50s and 60s, a phase of life that was unimaginable a century ago. The struggle now is to complete the journey, to move from mere tolerance to unconditional, universal acceptance. We have traveled so far together. We started in the distant past, gazing at a burial site in France, wondering if that small child was love. We walked through the dark, cold years of the asylum and emerged into the bright, clear light of Trisomy 21.
And now we stand in the present, where the challenges are ethical, not just physical. The answer to the most complex ethical questions of the present is found in the quiet history we have uncovered. The intrinsic value of every single life.
The presence of people with Down syndrome is a constant, gentle lesson to humanity. They teach us that life is measured not by how fast you move or how complex your thoughts are, but by how well you connect, how purely you love, and how truly you live in the moment. The soft-spoken story of the forgotten lives is now a global chorus of affirmation.
Their future is no longer hidden in an institution, but is unfolding openly on screens, in classrooms, and in the quiet pride of their own homes. Let us now sit beside that excavation pit and truly observe the silent witness of the earth.
The location is in France, in a vast, ancient field that was once a small, forgotten community 15 centuries ago, right on the cusp of the early Middle Ages. In 2014, a team of researchers carefully excavated a grave. The earth was soft, loamy, and cold, and inside, resting for over 1,000 years, was the skeleton of a child. The initial analysis was painstaking. Anthropologists measured the cranial structure, the long bones, and the teeth. The findings were quiet, but profound. The child exhibited classic skeletal markers associated with Down syndrome: a flatter base of the skull, a particular curvature to the ear canal, and a slight misalignment of the neck vertebrae. Now, look at the grave itself. This is where the true, soft story resides. This child was not discarded.
This child was not cast into a common pit or left exposed to the elements. They were laid to rest with a deliberate, careful tenderness.
The position of the body was fetal, a common burial posture of the time, suggesting peace and return, but what speaks volumes are the grave goods. These are the items placed deliberately beside the body to accompany the soul on its journey. a quiet declaration of the person's value in life. In this particular burial, the child had been adorned. Imagine the rough, simple texture of the linen cloth that once wrapped them, now decayed to dust. Resting near where their small hand would have been were beads of simple jewelry. Around the neck, perhaps a small, precious amulet or charm. This tells us a deep, quiet truth about the human heart in that forgotten community.
In a world with no social services, no specialized institutions, and no scientific understanding of genetics, the child was sustained by acceptance and love.
The care required to raise a child with the challenges associated with trisomy 21 in a harsh, PI industrial world is immense. Yet, the community committed to that care, and when the child passed away, they were given the full ritual dignity accorded to any other member of the tribe or village.
The ancient earth holds this secret, that before diagnosis and documentation, there was simple belonging.
This individual was seen as a soul, not a deficit.
They mattered enough to be given beads, perhaps a small, painted ceramic vessel, and the profound sanctity of a prepared grave.
Their life, though different, was deemed sacred. This single burial site stands as a silent witness against the later, cold doctrines of eugenics and institutionalization. It whispers that exclusion is not the default human condition.
Inclusion is.
Let the light of France fade now. We drift west, far across the Atlantic, to the deep, heavy jungles of Mesoamerica, long before the rise of the great cities we know today.
We are looking at the foundational culture of this region. The Olmecs, as we first mentioned, the Olmecs were master sculptors, and they left behind a compelling, complex artistic tradition focused on the Wajagu.
Imagine the texture of the dark, polished jade and serpentine they used for their ceremonial figurines.
These figures often depict infants or small children with specific, striking facial features. A downturned, wide mouth,
a small, flat nose,
and eyes that appear slightly angled or almond-shaped. Anthropologists have long debated the meaning of the Wajagu.
Was it a mythological creature?
Was it a depiction of shamanic transformation? A strong, quieter theory persists that the Olmecs were documenting, with astonishing fidelity, the physical characteristics of individuals born with Down syndrome in Olmec cosmology. The Jaguar was the most powerful being on Earth.
It was a creature of duality, ruler of the night, master of the earth, a being that effortlessly moved between the physical world and the spirit world. It was a symbol of liminality, of being on the threshold. If the Olmecs were truly depicting people with Down syndrome in the guise of the Wajagu, the implications are profound. It suggests that this difference was seen not as a genetic flaw, but as a spiritual gift. These individuals were potentially revered. They may have been seen as having a closer connection to the spirit realm precisely because they were slightly different from the norm. Perhaps they were valued as intermediaries or as beings who possessed a natural, unbroken purity. Think of the contrast. The Victorian mind would later label these features a regression to an inferior race. The Olmec mind, millennia earlier, may have labeled these features an ascent to the level of the most sacred, powerful animal in their universe. The Olmec artifacts are a testament to the power of cultural interpretation. Without a clinical term, the ancient world used its own language of myth and reverence to explain the unexplainable. This quiet reverence, captured in unmoving stone, reminds us that how we define difference determines how we treat difference. Our archaeological search is not limited to these dramatic findings. The evidence, though circumstantial, is scattered across the globe, emphasizing the universal presence of trisomy 21 throughout human history.
We look briefly now to the high, dusty plains of the Andes.
Researchers examining ancient skeletons from the Pre-Columbian era have occasionally noted skull characteristics consistent with trisomy 21. These people lived in extremely demanding physical environments, and the very fact that these individuals survived into childhood or young adulthood suggests a high degree of community support and care in societies where life was already brutally difficult.
And of course, there is the ongoing academic discussion regarding potential skeletal evidence from ancient Rome and Egypt.
While definitive DNA confirmation is difficult with ancient remains, the quiet persistence of these morphological signs in various burial sites suggests a common thread. Down syndrome has always been a natural variation of the human genome. It is as old as our species. Let us now return, with a new depth of understanding, to ancient Egypt. Here, the evidence is not in bone, but in belief. The god Baius. He is one of the most intriguing and beloved figures in the Egyptian pantheon.
He is often depicted with features consistent with dwarfism, including short limbs and a large head, but some features also align with the spectrum of physical traits seen in Down syndrome. A somewhat flattened face, a slight prognathism, and often a tongue protruding slightly, crucially.
BES was not a grand god of the sun or the sky.
He was a domestic god. He was the god of the bedroom. He was the protector of sleep, of new mothers, and of children. Imagine an Egyptian mother preparing her home for a new baby, perhaps 5,000 years ago. She would paint BES's image on her walls. She would place a small amulet of BES near the bed.
Why? Because BES's appearance, his difference, was seen as a source of power.
He was the strange one, the funny one, the fierce little defender who scared away demons and bad dreams with his comical, slightly unnerving looks.
The Egyptians revered difference when it served a function.
If you were a person with a physical difference, you might be a priest, a court official, or a keeper of the king's wardrobe, as many people with dwarfism were.
This was integration through function. In the case of BES, the representation of difference was elevated to the status of divine protection. The child with Down syndrome, in this cultural view, was not an omen of fear.
They were under the direct protection of a specific, fiercely dedicated god.
BES's image is a quiet, continuous affirmation. The softest, most vulnerable parts of life are guarded by a force that is visually distinct. This deep dive into archaeology and myth reveals a crucial distinction that will anchor the rest of our 1200 word journey. Ancient interpretation. Difference was interpreted through a lens of spirituality, power, or myth. The person was revered, protected, or feared, but they were rarely seen as merely a scientific error.
They occupied a significant, if often misunderstood, role. Later clinical interpretation. Difference would be interpreted through a lens of pathology, deficit, and science.
The person was removed from the spiritual structure and placed into the clinical category of abnormalcy. The forgotten lives are not only forgotten in the medical records, they were forgotten in the transition from spiritual to clinical thought.
The ancient world granted them a sense of profound belonging that the Enlightenment, in its rush to classify, accidentally stripped away. We will carry the quiet dignity of that French burial and the spiritual power of the Olmec Jaguar with us as we move forward.
These are anchors. In the next part of our exploration, we will look in depth at the world that followed the classical Mediterranean.
We will compare the philosophical approach to difference in Sparta, which focused on physical perfection, versus Rome, which often incorporated people with differences into specific roles, albeit complex ones.
We will watch the first shadows of cold, systematic decision-making creep into the human story. We are traveling to the sun-drenched, rugged landscape of the Mediterranean, the cradle of Western philosophy and law. This is a world obsessed with form, logic, and physical perfection. The societies we are about to explore, particularly ancient Greece, were the first to move the question of human difference from the realm of myth to the realm of state policy. This is where the forgotten lives first encountered the chilling concept of the ideal citizen, the Spartan silence, the cult of the perfect body. Our first stop is the harsh, proud city-state of Sparta. Imagine the dry, dusty air, the smell of leather and sweat, and the constant, rhythmic sound of military training. Sparta's entire existence was centered on the polis, the state, and the relentless pursuit of military strength. Every human life was seen as a resort, and every resource had to be optimized for the survival of the collective. Within this framework, the lives of infants were not decided by the parents' love, but by a council of elders.
According to the ancient historian Plutarch, the process was chillingly systematic.
Immediately after birth, the father would carry the baby to a place called the Leschi, a public gathering place.
Here, the elders would inspect the child. Imagine the quiet tension in that space.
The elders, cloaked in heavy wool, sitting in judgment. The silence is profound, broken only by the whimpering of the infant.
The criterion was simple and brutal: fitness.
If the child was judged well-built and sturdy, they were assigned to one of the 9,000 citizen lots of land and returned to the family. If, however, the child was deemed misshapen or weakly, they were considered unfit to live. The child was then condemned to be carried to the apotheke, the place of casting away. This was a chasm, a deep ravine in the foothills of Mount Taygetus. The existence of the apotheke, and the knowledge of its purpose, cast a permanent shadow over Spartan parenthood. For an infant born with the easily observable characteristics of Down syndrome, the hypertonia, low muscle tone, the distinctive facial features, The initial fragility, the judgment was swift and predetermined.
Their quiet life was ended for the cold logic of the state. The core philosophy at work here was the pursuit of the eidos, the ideal form, a concept later formalized by philosophers like Plato. Plato, in his seminal work The Republic, designed an ideal state where the breeding of citizens was carefully controlled, much like a master breeds livestock.
He argued that the state should raise the offspring of the good, but should hide away, or dispose of, the offspring of the inferior, and any of the offspring of the former that are born defective. In Sparta, this philosophical ideal was brutally, methodically actualized. The Spartan silence is perhaps the coldest chapter of the Forgotten Lives. It was a societal decision, mandated by law and philosophy, to prevent these lives from ever having a history. The individual was sacrificed entirely to the abstract concept of the perfect society, the Athenian choice, exposure, and the father's power.
Moving from the military camp of Sparta to the intellectual hub of Athens, the home of democracy, theatre, and high philosophy, the fate of an infant with a difference was only marginally kinder, and certainly more complex. In Athens, the decision was not made by the state, but rested with the Kyrios, the male head of the household, usually the father. The practice was known as expositio or exposure.
Imagine the scene. A family overwhelmed by poverty or the difficulty of raising a child with severe needs makes a devastating choice.
The infant is placed in a clay pot or small rush basket.
They are carried outside the city walls, usually to a known, well-traveled spot like a bridge or a temple step.
They are left with a few trinkets or tokens, not as grave goods, but as identifiers.
This was not immediate official execution, as in Sparta.
It was an act of abandonment, a gamble.
The infant might die of exposure, but there was also a chance, a slight, silent hope that a passerby, desperate for a child or simply moved by pity, would rescue and raise the child as a slave or a foundling for the child with Down syndrome, whose presence would have been obvious. Exposure in Athens was a tragic, isolating experience.
Their lives were reduced to a matter of chance, dependent on the whim of a stranger.
They were the forgotten lives placed literally outside the city gates. However, the Athenian practice highlights a key difference. The decision was personal, not governmental, and this personal choice left room for the heart to intervene.
There are accounts in ancient sources of people with disabilities, often referred to using clinical-sounding terms that overlap with intellectual disability, being kept at home, sometimes as a source of amusement, sometimes simply as a member of the family.
The Athenian society, with its greater economic diversity and less monolithic focus on military excellence, allowed for more grey area. Rome, the pragmatism of the paterfamilias. We journey now to the vast, powerful Roman Empire, which prided itself on its unwavering sense of law, order, and pragmatism. In Roman law, the power of the father, the paterfamilias, was absolute. This legal power, known as patria potestas, extended to the power of life and death over all children born into the family, especially infants. The 12 Tables, the foundation of Roman law, contained a chillingly brief clause: quickly kill a child who is monstrously deformed. The word monstrous is key here.
The Romans used the term monstra, which means marvels or warnings, for anything that deviated significantly from the norm.
This included any infant with a noticeable difference, such as those with features associated with trisomy 21. This power of the paterfamilias meant that the fate of the forgotten life was decided entirely by the family's economic, philosophical, and social status. The poor family. For a poor Roman family, the exposure or killing of a child with a disability was often an act of economic triage, a brutal necessity in a world with no safety net. The wealthy family. Here, the situation becomes darkly complex. Some wealthy families kept their children with intellectual disabilities hidden away, the continuation of the scholia practice.
But more frequently, people with differences were utilized for a specific, unsettling purpose: entertainment. The Roman elite had a strange fascination with people who were physically or intellectually different. They were sometimes bought and sold as slaves, and employed as Nainus dwarfs or Moria fools to serve as court jesters or living curiosities. Imagine a grand Roman feast. The light of the oil lamps is soft, the sound of wine pouring is continuous, and the air is heavy with the scent of perfume and rich food.
At the foot of the table, a person with Down syndrome is performing, mimicking the guests, making simple jokes, or showing off a specific learned skill. They are integrated. Yes, but integrated as property, stripped of selfhood and reduced to a form of living diversion. Yet, even in Rome, there were subtle cracks in this calculating facade. Occasionally, a wealthy family, believing that a person with a difference brought a certain kind of luck or spiritual connection, an echo of the Olmec belief, might adopt or cherish them as a kind of talisman. A life saved by superstition, not by compassion, but a life saved nonetheless. The philosophical turning point, Seneca and the Stoics. As the Roman Empire matured, its philosophies began to evolve. The cold, hard edge of early Stoicism, which advocated for the killing of infants who could not contribute, began to soften, albeit slowly. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, a key figure in the mid-1st century wrote not of law, but of humanity. He challenged the idea that a life without intellectual genius was valueless. While he did not explicitly condemn the practice of infanticide as it was deeply embedded in the law, his broader message of compassion and human connection laid the groundwork for future moral changes. The philosophical shift was subtle. Could one be a complete human being without being a perfect citizen? This slow, quiet change was hastened by the arrival of a revolutionary new force in the Roman world. Early Christianity, the Christian and Jewish traditions brought a profound, unwavering belief in the sanctity of all life, regardless of ability or capacity. They held that every person was created in the image of God. Imagine the quiet, clandestine meetings of the early Christians in the Roman catacombs. They are gathering the discarded lives. They are raising the exposed infants. The early church explicitly and unequivocally condemned the practice of exposure and infanticide, viewing it as murder. This was the first major, organized, and sustained societal challenge to the calculating philosophy of the classical world. The forgotten lives, abandoned by the state and the paterfamilias, were slowly, quietly being gathered into the fold of the church. This shift from the judgment of the leschi to the welcoming embrace of the community marks the true beginning of the long road to true care and protection. The laws would not change for centuries, but the cultural heart had begun to move. We close this segment standing on the edge of the collapse of the Roman Empire. The laws that permitted infanticide and exposure will eventually be swept away by the tide of the incoming medieval era, with its dominant Christian and Islamic cultures. These new societies, with their emphasis on charity, pilgrimage, and the inherent dignity of the soul, will redefine what it means to care for the least among us. The child with the distinctive features once left for the sun on a temple step will soon be welcomed into the sheltering walls of the monastery and the royal court. The shame of the monster is about to be softened by the quiet reverence for the innocent. Let us allow the harsh echo of the Roman Forum to fade entirely. We step now into a softer, quieter world, draped in devotion and ritual. The Middle Ages, the defining characteristic of this new era, driven by the expansion of Christianity and Islam, was the primacy of the soul. The perfection of the body, which had been everything to the Spartans and the Romans, was now seen as secondary, fleeting. The true, eternal value of a person lay in their spirit, and that spirit, regardless of its earthen vessel, was made in the image of the divine. This spiritual shift had immediate, life-saving consequences for the forgotten lives, the divine mandate, the end of exposure. The most immediate and profound change was the official, systematic condemnation of exposure and infanticide. Where Roman law had permitted the paterfamilias to discard a child deemed monstrous, the Church and the growing legal systems based on its doctrines declared this practice a sin and a crime. Imagine the difference in the atmosphere of a poor village hut. The birth of a child with clear differences is still a moment of fear of poverty, fear of the unknown. But the terror of having to carry the child to the city steps and abandon them is lifted. The community now has a moral, spiritual obligation to sustain that life. This obligation translated into the establishment of the first true, large-scale systems of care, the monastic sanctuaries, the quiet walls of the monastery. The monastery and the convent became the primary haven for the forgotten lives. They were places of refuge, built not on the principle of scientific research or state control, but on the principle of charity, the Christian call to love one's neighbor as oneself. Walk with me now, in the early morning light, into the peaceful inner courtyard of a Benedictine monastery. The air is cool and smells of damp stone, and the faint, sweet scent of incense from the early morning mass. The sound is dominated by the quiet, rhythmic chanting of the monks and the gentle scraping of boots on stone. These religious communities took on the task of custodial care. Parents who were too poor or too ill to raise a child with significant needs would bring them to the cloister gate.
The child would be taken in, given rough woolen clothes, fed simple bread and broth, and given a place to sleep.
The life there was simple, structured, and crucially, safe.
The rhythms of the monastic life, the chanting, the bells marking the hours, the silence provided a calm, predictable environment. While there was no specialized therapy as we know it, there was a constant presence of gentle care and spiritual acceptance. The monks and nuns were driven by a profound, if quiet, belief that caring for the vulnerable was serving Christ himself. The individuals with intellectual disabilities living within the monastery walls were known by various gentle names, God's lambs, or the holy innocents. They were often seen as being closer to a state of grace because they were believed to be incapable of the complex sins of the adult world: pride, greed, malice. They were the unblemished souls.
Imagine a young person with Down syndrome helping an elderly monk in the garden, gently watering the herbs or sorting the parchment.
The work is slow, perhaps imperfect, but it is done with genuine, visible joy. In the eyes of the monastery, this simple joy and purity of heart held more value than all the theological debates of the great universities, the sacred in the court, the holy fool. The concept of the innocent extended beyond the cloister and into the world of power, the royal and noble courts. Here, the person with an intellectual disability often held a unique, complex, and sometimes respected position as a holy fool or a court innocent. This role was very different from the Roman slave used for crude entertainment.
The medieval fool was a truth teller, protected by their perceived simplicity. Since they could not fully grasp social etiquette or political scheming, they were considered incapable of lying or ambition. Imagine a king or a duke sitting at his heavy oak table, surrounded by scheming courtiers and nervous advisers.
The court innocent, perhaps sitting quietly on a stool near the hearth, might say something jarringly simple, or ask a question that exposes a courtier's lie. The words are seen not as an insult, but as a kind of divine commentary, a truth delivered from a source untouched by worldly corruption. The presence of the innocent in the highest places of power served a spiritual purpose. It was a constant, visible reminder to the powerful that humility and simplicity were the ultimate virtues. It was a public act of piety, the ruler demonstrating their Christian charity by sheltering the weak. The forgotten life in this context was deliberately, ritually placed at the very center of power. The changeling shadow a deeper look. It is crucial to remember, however, that the Middle Ages were a bridge between paganism and monotheism. The old fears did not vanish, they simply transformed. The changeling myth, which we introduced earlier, reached its peak during this time.
The explanation for a child with developmental differences was that fairies or elves had swapped the human baby for a sickly, crying, non-developing elf child. This myth was a psychological comfort for mothers. It meant that their perfect child was safe with the fairies,
and the difficult child they were raising was merely a demanding substitute. This fear led, in some tragic cases, to attempts to torment the elf child until the fairies brought the real baby back. Here, the quiet, protective influence of the church was vital. Priests often discouraged the persecution of changelings, while they might occasionally suggest a blessing or an exorcism to drive out the perceived demonic or elven influence. Their primary concern was the soul of the child.
Whether elf or human, the child was a creature with a soul and was therefore due protection.
The Church's enduring condemnation of murder helped shield these vulnerable children from the worst superstitions of their neighbors. A quiet expansion, here in the Islamic Golden Age.
To complete our view of the gentle hand of faith, we must look south and east to the flourishing empires of the Islamic Golden Age.
Here, the commitment to the care of the sick and vulnerable was often the most advanced in the world. The tenets of Islam, particularly the principle of zakat, mandatory charity, and the command to care for the poor and the afflicted, fueled the creation of sophisticated Bimaristans hospitals.
These were not just for the physically sick.
They were often divided into wards that included care for people with mental and intellectual differences.
Imagine the atmosphere inside a great hospital in Baghdad or Cairo in the 10th century. There is warm and smells of spices and medicinal herbs.
The focus is on hygiene, kindness, and treatment. The records from these Bimaristans suggest that people with intellectual disabilities were treated with dignity, provided with specialized diets, and protected by law. The forgotten life in the Islamic world was often one of the most securely protected by the state's ethical and religious mandate.
The medieval period, therefore, represents a fundamental revaluation. The forgotten lives were no longer measured by the ruler, the weapon, or the logic of contribution, but by the infinite value of the soul. They were moved from the peril of the mountain ravine to the safety of the stone-walled cloister. This age of sanctuary was not perfect. Stigma still existed, fear lingered, but the underlying moral structure was one of inclusion and profound duty. As we transition out of the Middle Ages, the light of the Renaissance begins to dawn. The quiet, devotional life of the monastery will be challenged by the return of humanism and the new emphasis on human anatomy and intellect. The holy innocent will be viewed not as a spiritual object, but as a biological subject, settled into the quiet. Let the sound of the medieval chant fade entirely, replaced by the faint, rhythmic scratching of a scholar's quill on heavy parchment. We are in the age of humanism, the Renaissance. The focus of the world shifts from the heavens back to the earth, from the eternal soul to the miracle of the human form. This period is marked by an explosion of art, architecture, and, crucially, a new curiosity about the inner workings of the body. The forgotten lives now face a profound recategorization. They are no longer primarily holy innocents deserving of protection. They are becoming anatomical subjects deserving of examination. The knife and the quill. Anatomy's cold light. The core of the Renaissance intellectual revolution was the systematic study of human anatomy. Figures like Andreas Vesalius, breaking with centuries of tradition, began dissecting the human body to understand its precise engineering. The publication of books filled with detailed anatomical drawings depicting muscle, bone, and organ with breathtaking accuracy celebrated the perfection of the norm. Imagine the atmosphere in the anatomical theatre, the scent of preservation fluids and old leather, the sharp, metallic sound of the dissecting tools. The goal was to define the perfect blueprint in defining perfection. The Renaissance simultaneously, and perhaps inadvertently, defined deviation. The existence of a life that did not conform to the ideal, symmetrical, mathematically perfect form now presented a scientific puzzle, not just a spiritual mystery. This led to the first slow, uncoordinated attempts to classify and record human difference in a clinical, rather than mythological, context. The language was still clumsy, borrowed from Latin, using terms like fatuous or idioto words that implied simple deficiency without any attempt at specific diagnosis. But the intent was new, to catalogue nature's variations, the artist's truth, fidelity and spiritual grace. Before the medical text caught up, the most accurate recording of Down syndrome features came not from doctors, but from artists. The artists of the Renaissance, masters of observation, depicted the world exactly as they saw it. As we noted, sometimes this meant including a specific beloved child with distinctive features in a religious scene. Revisit the masterpiece by Andrea Mantegna, The Adoration of the Magi. Look closely at the Christ child. Many art historians believe Mantegna depicted a child with the characteristic features of trisomy 21, the flatness of the face, the upward slant of the eyes, the small hands. Why would the artist choose to portray the Savior of the world with this particular difference? It is the final, powerful echo of the medieval concept of the innocent. By bestowing the features of difference upon the Christ child, the artist was making a quiet, profound theological statement. Difference is holy. It is not a flaw. It is imbued with grace. It implies a deeper, purer connection to the divine precisely because the soul is free from the intellectual cunning and malice of the adult world. The tension in the Renaissance is palpable. The scientist wielding the knife, seeking the biological error, and the artist wielding the brush, asserting the spiritual perfection. The forgotten lives were caught between these two powerful, competing narratives, the Wunderkammer, marvel or pathology. As the Renaissance transitioned into the early modern period, a peculiar phenomenon arose among the wealthy elite and early collectors, the cabinet of curiosity, or Wunderkammer. Imagine a large, dimly lit room in a nobleman's estate. It is filled with shelves and glass cases overflowing with strange objects, iridescent shells from newly discovered lands, fossils, two-headed lambs preserved in jars, intricate clocks, and strange mechanical automata. The Wunderkammer was an attempt to collect and classify the entire world, encompassing both art and nature's errors. The unfortunate consequence was that people with profound physical or intellectual differences were sometimes included in these collections. They were viewed as living curiosities, subjects of fascination that blurred the line between the natural world and the monstrous. Imagine the sound of hushed, excited chatter as guests are led into this room. The person with Down syndrome is there, dressed in ornate clothes, perhaps performing a simple task or standing still for inspection.
They are not a slave, nor are they a revered holy fool. They are an object of study and spectacle. This era represents a slide backwards in dignity.
The spiritual respect of the monastery is lost, replaced by the detached, clinical gaze of the collector.
They are now seen as a scientific marvel, fascinating, but fundamentally dehumanized.
The forgotten life is now remembered, but not seen as a fully human person. The fading light of the jester, the transition, is also clearly visible in the role of the jester.
The medieval holy fool was protected by God.
The 17th century secular jester was protected only by the king's passing amusement.
The role became harsher, more focused on crude mockery and quick wit, demanding a level of performance that was often beyond the natural capacity of those with intellectual disabilities. For many with Down syndrome, the role diminished, and they were often relegated to simpler, more custodial roles within wealthy households.
Or more commonly, they remained with poor families, where their care remained a difficult, quiet burden.
It is in this period that we see the first tentative beginnings of what would become the institutional impulse. As cities grew and the old networks of monastic and familial care began to buckle under the weight of population, specialized, often brutal, city-run poorhouses and workhouses began to appear. These were not specialized for disability, but they became the first places where the poor, the mad, the sick, and the intellectually disabled were grouped together indiscriminately. The Enlightenment's new categories.
As the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, the pace of classification accelerated. Thinkers like Carolus Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, created vast, intricate systems for classifying all of nature, plants, animals, and yes, human beings. In the 18th century medical books, the attempt to categorize intellectual differences solidified. While still lacking the crucial genetic understanding, physicians began to categorize the spectrum of disability based on observable severity and assumed causes: head trauma, poor environment, or birth defect. The forgotten lives are now becoming statistical figures and diagnostic categories. The stage is being set for the ultimate 19th century question. If we can define this difference, can we also control it? This age of observation laid the essential groundwork for John Langdon Down.
Without the anatomical research of the Renaissance and the taxonomic fever of the Enlightenment, he could never have sat in his Victorian asylum and attempted to give a specific, named classification to the group of patients he observed. The quiet, gentle acceptance of the Middle Ages has given way to the cold, analytical gaze of the scientist.
The forgotten lives are standing on the precipice of the Victorian era, where curiosity will quickly transform into classification, and classification will tragically give way to segregation. Let the light of the Renaissance oil lamps dim. Let the sound of the collector's cabinet door gently close.
We are heading for the brick and fog of 19th century England, where the first formal diagnosis of our story will finally be made.
The devotional calm of the monastery is gone, replaced by the precise, driving rhythm of the Industrial Revolution. We are in Victorian England, an age of steam, steel, and a relentless, pervasive desire to catalogue and control the natural world. If the Renaissance was about observation, the Victorian era was about taxonomy, the science of classification.
The existence of human difference could no longer be a spiritual mystery or a simple family burden.
It had to be a medical management problem. This context leads us directly to the life of a complicated and compassionate man, Dr. John Langdon Down, the Reformer's heir. Dr. John Langdon Down, born in 1828, John Langdon Down was not the product of the typical English medical establishment. His background was in science, not elite schooling.
He trained first as an apprentice to a pharmacist and later as a chemist, immersing himself in the objective, systematic methods of the laboratory.
This unusual path gave him a unique perspective. He was a natural progressive, a liberal thinker who believed deeply in social reform.
When he entered the world of medicine, he was drawn to the most difficult, most overlooked sphere of human care, the field of intellectual disability, or as it was then clumsily called, idiocy. His progressive views led him to reject the prevailing philosophy of the time, which often treated people with severe disabilities as subhuman and beyond help. Down was a devoted follower of the concept of moral treatment, the idea that kindness, gentle routine, education, and dignity could improve the lives of the institutionalized, a philosophy we first glimpsed in the compassion of the Islamic Primaristans in 1858. At the age of 30,
Downe accepted the role of medical superintendent at the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots in Surrey. Earlswood, the observation deck.
Imagine Earlswood. It is a vast, imposing structure of red brick, built in the Italianate style, surrounded by manicured but high wood grounds.
The interior is characterized by long, echoing corridors, the smell of disinfectant, and the perpetual, heavy ticking of a dozen clocks regulating the institutional day, while other doctors saw only a chaotic collection of untreatable patients. Downe, the keen chemist and observer, began his meticulous work. He treated the asylum like a vast laboratory. He didn't just walk the wards, he studied the residents. Imagine him standing quietly, fountain pen in hand, observing the patients during their meals, their work periods, and their rare moments of recreation. He was looking for shared characteristics, searching for a pattern, a thread of unity that could explain the diversity of developmental delays he encountered, and he found one. He began to notice a specific group of individuals who, despite coming from widely varied families, some poor, some wealthy, shared a striking physical and temperamental profile. He noted their smaller stature, their distinctive facial features, their frequent presence of congenital heart issues, and their gentle, often humorous, and rhythmic dispositions. It was this realization that a specific type of intellectual disability could be observed as a unified group that was his true, quiet genius.
He was the first to recognize Down syndrome as a distinct clinical entity within the larger spectrum of intellectual difference. The 1866 paper, The Flawed Label. Downe published his observations in 1866 in a paper titled Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots. To understand the paper's tragic error, we must understand the pressure of the Victorian age.
This was the peak of racial taxonomy. Scientists and anthropologists, following the work of thinkers like Blumenbach, were obsessed with creating a rigid, hierarchical classification of the human races: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, etc. The scientific mission was to explain everything through racial difference. When Dr. Downe looked at the distinct features of this patient group, specifically the almond shape of the O's and the epicanthic fold, he attempted to fit his observation into the only available framework, racial anthropology. He theorized, incorrectly, that these patients represented a reversion or arrested development toward what he termed the Great Mongol Family. His theory was that humanity was a single, unified species, but that some forms of intellectual disability caused individuals to regress to earlier, non-Caucasian racial types. This classification, the coining of the term Mongolism, was a colossal scientific mistake, steeped in the prejudice of his era.
It linked a medical condition to a false racial etiology that caused immense pain and misdirection for a century.
However, we must note the complexity. Downe's underlying progressive intent was to argue that all human beings are part of a unified species.
By classifying the patients under an ethnic heading, however offensive, he was arguing that they were not entirely separate, hopeless aberrations, but were part of a defined, if misunderstood, human category. His attempt to categorize them was an attempt to give them a clinical presence that demanded medical attention. Normansfield, the practice of compassion.
The contradiction between his flawed science and his compassionate practice is the most poignant part of his legacy.
Downe quickly grew frustrated with the limitations of the large impersonal state asylum. In 1868, he and his wife, Mary Downe, who was an immense partner in his work, founded their own private institution, Normansfield in Teddington. Normansfield was intended to be the ultimate expression of moral treatment.
It was a gentle, dignified home designed for the wealthy, where the forgotten lives could truly flourish.
Imagine the atmosphere at Normansfield.
The large red brick house is filled not with the smell of disinfectant, but with the scent of beeswax polish and fresh flowers from the grounds. The residents wore fine clothes, they ate with proper cutlery, and they were expected to follow a dignified daily routine. The focus was on education and the arts.
Downe recognized the innate sense of rhythm and the talent for mimicry in his patients.
He and Mary organized concerts, lessons in drawing and carpentry, and most famously built a beautiful, elaborate theatre right on the grounds. Imagine the sound of music filling the air,
the soft scratch of charcoal on paper. The patients were not subjects.
They were performers.
Downe observed that when treated with respect and given a role to play, The residents showed remarkable progress and a deep capacity for happiness and affection. The Nomansfield approach was a direct, living refutation of the cold, mongoloid label. He proved that the supposed regression was simply a lack of opportunity.
The mongoloid in his paper was a diagnostic label.
The person in his care was a soul deserving of love and potential.
The weight of a name John Langdon Down died in 1896, leaving behind a profound and ethically complicated legacy.
He was the first person in history to define Down syndrome as a distinct condition, pulling it out of the general haze of intellectual disability. For this, his name is attached to the condition today. But he also provided the most harmful label in the condition's history.
The term Mongolism became an all-purpose, easy slur that outlived his kindness and fueled a century of racial bias, shame, and scientific confusion. His clinical error was soon seized upon by a darker movement that did not share his compassion. As the Victorian era turns into the 20th century, the beautiful, gentle light of Nomansfield is about to be extinguished by the cold, calculating shadow of eugenics. The medical world will forget his compassionate practice and only remember his dangerous taxonomy. The classification, born of one man's flawed curiosity, will become the excuse for mass institutionalization. We have entered the 20th century. John Langdon Down is dead, but his flawed term, Mongolism, is alive and flourishing in medical textbooks across the globe.
His attempt at classification has been corrupted into an engine of segregation. The foundation philosophy of this era is eugenics, the weaponization of taxonomy. The eugenics movement, popular among scientists, politicians, and social reformers across America, Britain, Scandinavia, and Germany, sought to improve the human gene pool.
It was driven by a deep-seated fear, the fear that the unfit were reproducing faster than the fit and would eventually drag down the civilization.
Down's clinical error, the belief that the condition represented a racial regression, was instantly seized upon by eugenicists. They used the term mongoloid to argue that the condition was proof of inherited biological deficiency that posed a threat to the nation's racial purity and economic efficiency. The logic was chillingly simple, statistical, and devoid of humanity. A life with a significant difference was deemed a cost burden to the state.
The solution was systematic, permanent removal. This decision to categorize the forgotten lives as defective and unfit led to the construction of vast, isolated state institutions. This was the coldest institutional winter of our story. The walls of isolation. Imagine one of these massive, sprawling compounds, built in the early 1900s estate school or colony in the rural outskirts of an American or European city. The architecture itself was a declaration of policy. Massive, uniform buildings of grey concrete or severe brick.
They were designed not for healing, but for custody and permanent isolation. They were built to keep the defectives in, and to keep the public's conscience out. Walk with me quietly through the grounds.
There are smells of cut grass and institutional coal smoke. The primary sound is not the gentle human voice, but the echo of hard shoes on tiled floors, the clanging of metal utensils, and the constant, overwhelming noise of hundreds of people living with almost no privacy. Inside, the environment was designed to erase individuality. Clothes were rough, standardized uniforms. Personal possessions were non-existent.
The sensory environment was one of profound deprivation. Long, echoing corridors, harsh overhead lighting, and a lack of the personal touch. A painted wall, a soft toy, a comforting hand that a developing mind desperately needs.
For the person with Down syndrome, who thrives on connection and tailored stimulation, this environment was devastating. It was here, in the cold, echoing silence of the state school, that the life expectancy dropped to its lowest point, and potential was extinguished by neglect, the tyranny of the IQ test. The eugenics movement solidified its control through the misuse of intelligence testing. The newly developed IQ tests were rapidly deployed in institutions, and the score became the unchallengeable measure of a life's worth.
People with Down syndrome were quickly and universally labeled with the lowest categories, idiots or imbeciles, terms that were clinical diagnoses before they became common insults.
This score was then entered into a permanent ledger, justifying their lifelong confinement. The test scores erased the person.
They erased the affectionate nature, the sense of rhythm, the capacity for simple joy that John Langdon Down had observed.
The score replaced the soul, the ultimate control. Sterilization laws. The most tragic expression of the eugenics movement was the push for compulsory sterilization. The logic was simple. If we cannot contain the defectives, We must ensure they cannot breed in the United States. By 1930, over 30 states had passed compulsory sterilization laws targeting the institutionalized. The ultimate legal validation came in 1927 with the Supreme Court case Buckviec. Bill Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote the majority opinion, which contained one of the most chilling sentences in legal history. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This single sentence, written in the highest court in the land, ratified the state's right to control the reproduction of its unfit citizens.
It stripped the forgotten lives of their fundamental human autonomy. The right to love, the right to form a family, was deemed a danger to the state. Imagine the trauma in the sterile, cold hospital wing of the institution.
The whispered fear, the lack of understanding, the surgical procedure done not to save a life, but to eliminate a potential future, the quiet tragedy of the crib ward.
The institutional coldness was often fatal, particularly for infants. Many babies born with Down syndrome were separated from their mothers at birth and sent directly to state hospitals. Imagine a large, dimly lit nursery, known as a crib ward.
The room is lined with simple, metal cribs.
The infants lie alone, often with minimal clothing, receiving only the most basic custodial care, feeding and changing. There is a terrible, pervasive silence. There is no sound of a mother's voice, no soft singing, no rocking, no gentle skin-to-skin contact. The infants often suffered from low muscle tone and heart defects, which meant they needed extra warmth, careful feeding, and gentle stimulation.
Instead, they received sensory and emotional starvation. During this era, a philosophy known as benign neglect was practiced by many physicians.
Faced with an infant with a heart defect and a diagnosis of mongolism, doctors would often advise the parents and institution to let nature take its course. No life-saving surgery was offered.
No antibiotics were rushed in. The life was simply allowed to fade. It is in these silent, empty cribs that the forgotten lives were extinguished the fastest. This neglect is the reason the average lifespan for people with Down syndrome plummeted during the institutional winter. The shadow of the ultimate policy, the widespread global adoption of eugenics, the forced sterilization in America and Scandinavia, the institutional isolation in Britain, the cold, clinical philosophy everywhere created the terrible context for the greatest horror in Germany.
The Nazi regime simply took the universally accepted ideas of racial purity and life unworthy of life to their absolute extreme conclusion. The T for Euthanasia program targeted children and adults with disabilities, marking them for systematic murder.
The very first victims of the Holocaust were not chosen by race, but by diagnosis. The forgotten lives in Germany paid the ultimate price for the world's cold, calculating scientific fear. We do not dwell on the horrors of that program here, but we must acknowledge the shadow it casts. The T4 program was the final, devastating, logical endpoint of the eugenics philosophy that gripped the entire developed world. We leave this segment with the sound of the steel door of the institution locking shut. This was the age of separation, of control, and of the profoundest forgetting.
But the light of discovery is coming.
The parents, shattered by the shame of this era, will soon begin to gather in quiet defiance. The coldest winter cannot last forever. The world has just witnessed the unspeakable conclusion of the philosophy of eugenic purity, the sheer horror of the concentration camps, and the revelations of the T for Euthanasia program, where the systematic murder of people with disabilities was the very first step shocked humanity into a slow, agonizing reevaluation of the sanctity of life. The moral authority of eugenics was utterly broken. The fear-driven philosophy of the state controlling who lives and dies was discredited. But the systems built on that philosophy, the massive, isolated institutions, were still standing, and the shame attached to the diagnosis of Mongolism was still pervasive, the mother's conspiracy, the first gatherings. The true revolution of this era was driven not by doctors or politicians, but by parents, overwhelmingly mothers, who had been told to forget their children. They were tired of the whispered advice, the shame, and the professional certainty of the doctors who insisted their child was unfit and beyond help. Imagine a small group gathering in a church basement in New York City, or a living room in Manchester, England, around 1948.
The air is tense with suppressed grief and defiance. These were the first parent advocacy groups. They formed because the mothers realized they had been lied to. When they were told their child was an idiot who would never develop, they had observed a different reality. A child who laughed, who had a strong sense of mimicry, who loved music, and who showed profound, uncomplicated affection. They were sharing tactics.
Did you know if you massage their joints, The low muscle tone improves.
I found a teacher willing to work with him for 15 minutes a day.
The very first national organizations, such as the National Association of Parents and Friends of Mentally Retarded Children, later the ARC and the US, began to form out of these small, clandestine meetings.
Their goal was simple yet revolutionary: to demand dignity, care, and a future for their children.
This movement was a quiet resistance against the prevailing medical and institutional dogma. It was an affirmation that love and environment could unlock potential that the IQ test had sworn was impossible. The forgotten lives, hidden behind asylum walls, were suddenly being talked about, and their worth was being affirmed by the most powerful advocates in the world, their own families. The search for the biological root.
While parents fought on the moral and social front, the quiet, parallel struggle was taking place in the laboratory. The search for the true biological cause. The flawed label Mongolism could only be destroyed by a superior, unassailable scientific truth.
We return to the world of genetics, which was undergoing a revolution in the 1950s. For decades, scientists had only rough, imprecise images of human chromosomes.
They believed there were 48 chromosomes, not 46, and they couldn't see the tiny strands clearly enough to count them accurately.
The techniques for preparing and staining cell samples were primitive. Imagine the tedious, difficult work in the small laboratories of the era.
The hours spent staring through a microscope, trying to make sense of the tangled mess of genetic material.
In 1956, two scientists, Johan J. Gio and Albert Levan, working in Sweden, achieved the breakthrough. They accurately counted the 46 human chromosomes.
This single, precise count standardized the field and provided the essential baseline for all future discovery. Now, scientists had the normal count.
The stage was set to identify the difference, the Parisian breakthrough. Dr. Jeremy Lefern, our focus returns to the quiet, determined work being done in Paris. Drift forward with me now.
We are moving from the quiet solitude of the laboratory and the clandestine meetings of parents into the bright, harsh glare of the television screen. The 1960s and 1970 seconds marked a profound transformation in Western society. It was the age of civil rights, where marginalized groups stood up to demand equal rights, dignity, and recognition. The parents of the forgotten lives, now armed with the scientific truth of Trisomy 21 Part 13, realized that their children's struggle was fundamentally a civil rights issue, the right to belong. The enemy was no longer just ignorance.
It was segregation. The walls come down. The media exposed the crucial first step was breaking the self-imposed silence of the institutions.
For decades, state schools and asylums had operated behind high walls, invisible to the public conscience. In the early 1970s, investigative journalists and courageous whistleblowers began to expose the horrific, inhumane conditions inside some of these massive institutions.
The most famous and most gut-wrenching was the exposure of Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, New York. Imagine the quiet shock of a public watching the evening news. The images are stark and unforgettable. Hundreds of residents, neglected, malnourished, lying unclothed on bare floors, suffering from chronic illness and profound sensory deprivation. This was the final, undeniable proof that the institutional system, born of the eugenics movement, was not a place of care, but a place of systematic,
structural neglect.
The suffering of the residents, many of whom were individuals with Down syndrome, was not due to their diagnosis, but due to their isolation.
This media exposure was a moral earthquake.
It generated widespread public revulsion and provided the parent advocacy movement with the necessary fuel to achieve legislative change.
The public saw that the system was monstrous, not the person inside it. The movement for deinstitutionalizers, this public outcry initiated the long, slow, difficult process of deinstitutionalizers. The goal was to close the massive state schools and move the residents back into the community, often into group homes, small residential settings designed to provide a more natural, familiar environment.
Imagine the atmosphere in the closing wards.
The silence is profound and heavy as the last few residents are helped into vans, their few meager belongings gathered. This process was complex and fraught with challenge. Communities often resisted the placement of group homes, and funding was constantly fought over. But the philosophy was unwavering. Every human being has the right to live among their peers.
The principle of normalization, the idea that every person, regardless of disability, should have access to patterns of life and conditions of everyday living that are as close as possible to the norm of society, became the guiding style of the movement. The fight for the classroom or the second, and perhaps most lasting, victory of this era was the legal fight for education. For decades, children with intellectual disabilities had been legally excluded from public schools.
School districts often argued they were uneducable or that the cost was too high.
The law provided no remedy. Parents, often banding together in legal aid societies, initiated a series of crucial legal battles. They argued, successfully, that exclusion based on disability was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
If education was a right afforded to all citizens, it must be afforded to citizens with disabilities. These legal victories culminated in one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of disability rights, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act (EHC) of 1975.
This law, which later became the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act (IDEA), mandated 5 profound requirements that changed the face of American education and influenced policy globally. Free appropriate public education FAPE. Every child is entitled to an education tailored to their specific needs. Least restrictive environment. LI.
Children must be educated alongside their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate inclusion. Individualized Education Program IEP. The creation of a legally binding document detailing the child's goals, services, and accommodations. Parental participation. Giving parents a voice and legal authority in the educational planning process. Due process. The right to legal recourse if the school system failed to meet its obligations.
Imagine the sound of that first school bell ringing for a child with Down syndrome who, just 10 years earlier, would have been condemned to a crib ward. The child, newly outfitted with a backpack and a lunchbox, is walking up the steps of a local school for the first time, an act of quiet, immense triumph for their parents. The classroom replaced the asylum as the center of the forgotten life's world. The rise of early intervention.
This era also solidified the importance of early intervention.
The new science of developmental pediatrics confirmed what Dr. Down had long suspected, that the environment profoundly shapes potential. Therapies including speech, physical, and occupational therapy were developed and delivered from infancy. This care was designed to leverage the brain's neuroplasticity, its ability to reorganize itself in the first few years of life, helping the child master developmental milestones that had been previously suppressed by neglect. The life of a baby with Down syndrome was no longer a period of waiting for institutionalization. It was a period of active, intensive development. Guided by parent advocates and dedicated therapists, the period from 1960 to 1980 was a powerful hinge in history. The institutional shame was broken by media exposure and legislative action. The fight for the rights of the forgotten lives was firmly established as part of the broader human rights movement. The children born during this period would become the first generation in history to attend public school, graduate, and enter a world that, though still imperfect, was obligated by law to include them. Breathe in slowly. We are now standing in the final decades of the 20th century, a time characterized by quiet, continuous progress. The laws are in place. The institutions are mostly emptying. The new focus is on maximizing the health span and the dignity of the fully included generation. The two most profound achievements of this era are linked: the medical revolution that allowed life to continue, and the social revolution that gave that life meaning. The quiet heroism of pediatric cardiology, the first major hurdle overcome was mortality.
Throughout the institutional era, the average life expectancy for a person with Down syndrome rarely exceeded 10 to 15 years.
The primary cause was often congenital heart defect (CHD), which affect nearly half of all individuals with trisomy 21. The 1980s saw the rapid advancement of pediatric cardiology and cardiac surgery. Imagine the atmosphere in the operating room. The light is intense, but the work is meticulously gentle. Surgeons, armed with advanced imaging and techniques, began to routinely repair the common heart defects, such as the atrioventricular septal defect (AVSD), which had previously been almost universally fatal. This was a quiet, continuous act of heroism. A single successful heart surgery on an infant in 1985 ensured that the promise of the 1975 education law could be fulfilled decades later. The child was no longer destined for a short life ending in the silence of a hospital.
They were given the chance for a full, long life. The results were astonishing. By the year 2000, the average life expectancy for a person with Down syndrome in developed countries had soared from the teens to over 55 years, and it continues to climb today.
This was the longevity leap, a silent revolution that fundamentally changed the trajectory of the forgotten lives. Suddenly, parents were planning for their children's retirement, not just their next birthday. The person with Down syndrome was now a fixture in the human life cycle, becoming an uncle, an aunt, and a grandparent. The mandate for health surveillance, the medical focus broadened beyond just the heart.
Physicians realized that trisomy 21 often predisposes individuals to other specific, manageable health conditions, thyroid disorders, celiac disease, hearing loss, and vision problems. This led to the creation of health checklists or guidelines for the medical care of individuals with Down syndrome.
These standardized protocols, developed in the late 1990s, mandated regular screenings and proactive treatment.
Imagine the care provided now. Routine checks for hypothyroidism, low thyroid function, careful testing for celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, and regular hearing and vision screenings. This meticulous, proactive medical management allowed individuals to thrive in the classroom, unburdened by undiagnosed pain or sensory deficits.
The forgotten life was now medically visible and comprehensively cared for. The dignity of work and independent living, with life expectancy secured and education mandated. The final push of this era was for economic and social integration. The question shifted to, what does a fulfilling adult life look like? The concept of supported employment gained traction. This rejected the old institutional model of sheltered workshops, where disabled adults worked for minimal pay in segregated settings, and advocated for placing individuals directly into competitive, integrated workplaces.
Imagine a person with Down syndrome proudly wearing a uniform, clocking in at a local grocery store or a library.
The sound of the cash register chiming.
The feeling of that first earned paycheck. This was not just about money.
It was about dignity and contribution. Work provides identity, structure, and social connection.
The sight of a person with Down syndrome working alongside their peers normalized their presence in the public square more effectively than any law could.
This employment push went hand in hand with the expansion of supported living. As the large institutions closed, the focus shifted to small, not institutional group homes or supervised apartments. Imagine the simple joy of having your own room, decorated to your own taste, and the freedom to choose what you want for dinner. After centuries of institutional control, this right to self-determination, the power to make simple, daily choices, was a monumental victory. The voice of self-advocacy, the most powerful revolution of the 1980s, and 1990 seconds was the emergence of the self-advocacy movement.
For the first time in history, the people with Down syndrome who had been saved by the parents' movement and educated by the new laws began to speak for themselves. They formed organizations such as People First, asserting their right to be heard on issues concerning their own lives. Imagine sitting in a conference room.
The atmosphere is respectful, determined. A speaker with Down syndrome, perhaps using a speech device or speaking slowly but clearly, addresses the audience. The message is universal and empowering. Nothing about us without us. They demanded to be included in discussions about policy, housing, education, and research.
They became the living, breathing proof that the traditional metrics of intelligence were incomplete. They demonstrated that qualities like empathy, compassion, loyalty, and joy are profound forms of human intelligence and societal contribution. The quiet, determined voices of the self-advocates completed the transition from the forgotten lives objects of charity or medical scrutiny to the visible citizen subjects of rights and self-determination. They taught society that the goal was not to make them normal, but to accept the beautiful complexity of their own norm. As the millennium turned, the children born in the age of inclusion were stepping confidently into adulthood, their hearts repaired, their bodies cared for, their rights secured,
and their voices strong. We are now standing at the very precipice of the modern era, where the final, deepest challenges will be ethical, genetic, and social. The final push for unconditional acceptance settle into the quiet again. We have traveled from ancient stone to the age of computers, and now we look at the very shape of our own time. The challenges facing the forgotten lives in the 21st century are not about visibility or basic rights. Those battles are largely won. The challenge is about existence and perception. This era is defined by the tension between scientific capacity and moral responsibility. The age of information. Mapping the 21st chromosome, the turn of the millennium brought the Human Genome Project to completion. The entire blueprint of human life was mapped, including every gene on chromosome 21. Imagine the microscopic precision of this information. Scientists moved from merely counting the chromosome trisomy 21 to understanding the function of the individual genes that are overexpressed, the specific molecular consequences of that extra copy. This led to the birth of precision medicine. The hope here is to develop therapies that can quiet those specific overactive genes, potentially mitigating the severity of associated conditions without altering the fundamental identity of the person. The most critical area of research today focuses on Alzheimer's disease, since nearly all adults with Down syndrome develop the specific plaques and tangles associated with Alzheimer's by age 40. They are, tragically, one of the most reliable populations for studying the disease. The forgotten lives have become invaluable contributors to the global medical fight against this devastating disease.
Their unique genetics are unlocking secrets that could save millions of lives, a profound reversal of their status from problem to be managed to scientific solution. The ethical labyrinth. Prenatal choice, however. The same genetic revolution that brought clarity and hope also brought an unprecedented moral challenge. Non-invasive prenatal testing NIPT. NIPT, developed in the early 2000s, allows for the highly accurate detection of trisomy 21 and other chromosomal differences using a simple blood draw from the mother, often as early as the first trimester.
This eliminated the risk associated with older, invasive tests. Imagine the atmosphere in the modern doctor's office. The conversation is private, hushed, and deeply complex. The technology provides information, but that information forces a choice that sits at the center of a swirling ethical storm. In many developed countries, the availability of highly effective screening has resulted in a significant decrease in the birth rate of children with Down syndrome. In some European nations, this rate approaches 90% or more. This reality has sparked a quiet but fierce debate within the global community. The debate is not about the technology itself, but about the societal message the results convey. The pro-choice argument upholds the autonomy of the parents to make deeply personal medical decisions based on their family's capacity, resources, and emotional preparedness. The disability rights argument asserts that high termination rates signal to the world that life with Down syndrome is inherently less valuable or inherently a tragedy to be avoided. The community asks, are we not worthy of existence? The response from the Down syndrome community has been powerful and visible. The quiet assertion of worth. They have used social media, film, and literature to share images and narratives of joy, success, and love, directly countering the medical narrative of deficiency.
They are forcing the global conversation to focus on the quality of life today, a quality vastly improved by inclusion, medical care, and acceptance. This is the ultimate modern struggle for the forgotten lives, to prove that a life with an extra chromosome is a life worthy of unconditional welcome. The power of visibility, media, and representation.
The 21st century is the age of unavoidable visibility. Social media platforms have bypassed the traditional gatekeepers of media, major studios, publishing houses, and allowed individuals with Down syndrome and their families to share their stories directly, globally, and instantly. The screen. Actors with Down syndrome are securing recurring roles in television and film, moving beyond small cameos to complex, fully dimensional characters. This is the final stage of normalization, seeing a person with a disability simply integrated into the fabric of a story, not defined solely by their diagnosis. The stage and the runway. Models and artists with Down syndrome are featured in major fashion campaigns and international art exhibits,
challenging outdated aesthetic standards and defining new metrics of beauty and talent.
This visibility ensures that the next generation of prospective parents, when faced with a prenatal diagnosis, can see a rich, full, and often joyous life unfolding before them, rather than the isolated, institutional fear of the past, the unfinished work, aging and equity. While acceptance has grown,
the work is not complete.
The current focus of advocacy centers on two key areas: aging and health equity. Since the longevity leap is so recent, The oldest generation of people with Down syndrome are the first to experience aging in the community. Advocates are fighting to ensure that healthcare systems, retirement communities, and long-term care facilities are equipped to handle the specific needs of this aging population, particularly the higher risk of early onset Alzheimer's disease.
Fighting implicit bias, the movement is now targeting the subtle, unconscious biases that still exist in hiring, housing, and social interaction.
This requires moving beyond mere tolerance to a culture of genuine celebration of neurodiversity. The forgotten lives, once hidden in the earth, then confined to the asylum, are now visible on every street corner and every screen. Their presence asks the deepest, most gentle question of our time: what, truly, is the meaning of a whole and perfect life? The historical answer, revealed in the quiet dignity of every century, is simple. A perfect life is one that is love.
We are looking for the quiet moments, the small, personal stories that the history books rarely record. We are traveling back to the 1,000 years between the fall of Rome and the rise of the machine, searching the hearts of the common people for the whispers of affection that sustained the forgotten lives.
The monastery's garden. Brother Anselm 1100s imagine a small, secluded Benedictine monastery in the damp, green heart of France, around the year 1130. The air smells of wet earth, wood smoke, and the faint, dusty scent of old prayer books. The sound is the scratch of the abbot's quill, and the constant, soft shuffle of monks' sandals on stone. In this cloister lives Brother Anselm.
He is not a professed monk, but an innocent who was left at the gate as an infant. He is now a grown man, recognized by his gentle, open face and his quiet, deliberate movements. Anselm cannot read the Latin prayers in the breviary.
He cannot follow the complex theological debates that occupy the senior monks. His intellectual understanding is focused entirely on the immediate, tangible world. His life is centered on a herb garden. Imagine Anselm kneeling on the cool earth, his rough woolen habit smelling of mint and lavender.
His hands, though small, are precise.
He is charged with sorting the dried seeds and separating the medicinal herbs, the lavender, the chamomile for sleep, the pungent rosemary. The senior monks value Anselm not for his labor, which is slow, but for his purity of heart. They believe, truly and quietly, that he is closer to the state of Eden than they are.
He is incapable of holding a grudge.
He does not covet or scheme.
His joy is simple and immediate. The warmth of the sun, the taste of a fresh berry, the sound of the evening bell. One day, a visiting bishop is questioning the abbot about the monastery's resources.
He sees Anselm, his head bent over a basket of drying thyme, gently rubbing the aromatic leaves between his fingers. The bishop asks in sharp, learned Latin, "Why do you waste coin and food on this man who cannot contribute to the work of God?" The abbot smiles quietly, his voice gentle and low. "The question is wrong, my lord.
He contributes most of all. When we struggle with pride or theological arrogance, Brother Anselm reminds us that God resides not in our clever words, but in the simplicity of the heart and the tenderness of the hand.
He is our living lesson in humility.
This small, intimate moment of justification, the shift from cost to moral value, is the quiet triumph of the medieval spirit. Anselm's only contribution was his presence, and that was deemed enough, too.
The king's reflection. The jester's silence 150s. We travel now to the turbulent, opulent court of an early modern king in the 1500s. The walls are tapestry covered. The atmosphere is heavy with ambition, and the sound is the constant, high-pitched clatter of court gossip and political intrigue. Meet Master Thomas. He is the court jester, employed not only for his ability to mimic and sing, but also because he is a person of difference, simple or natural, who, in that era, was still believed to possess a unique form of immunity from worldly malice. Thomas is quick-witted in a simple, rhythmic way, capable of composing short, rhyming couplets that poke fun at the courtiers.
But his most profound role is his silence.
Imagine the king sitting alone in his private chambers late at night, the fire low, a single candle casting long shadows on the gold and velvet.
He is burdened by war, betrayal, and the terrible weight of his decisions. He calls for Thomas. When Thomas arrives, he is dressed in his familiar motley, the bells on his hat jingling softly.
The king doesn't ask for a joke. He simply talks about the deceit of his advisers, the cost of his wars, the loneliness of command.
Thomas sits on the floor, gently fiddling with a piece of carved wood.
He doesn't offer advice. He doesn't offer complex solutions. He offers uncomplicated presence. When the king finally asks, "Thomas, what is it that troubles a man most?"
Thomas stops playing with the wood. He looks up at the king, his eyes wide and sincere, and his reply is simple, direct, and softly spoken. Having two minds when one heart is enough.
The king smiles, a genuine, deep smile that rarely reaches his eyes. The complexity of the court is instantly dissolved by the simple, unassailable truth offered by the innocent. This vignette reveals the quiet power of the innocent's truth.
In a world defined by duplicity and calculating intelligence, the person with an intellectual disability was the only one who could be trusted.
They were cherished, not because they were clever, but because they were honest.
Their lack of worldly sophistication made them a vessel for true reflection, protected by their simplicity. 3.
The Anatomist's Daughter. A father's private conflict 1650s. Our final stop is in a grand, busy city in the mid-17th century, the height of the early modern era. There are smells of coal smoke, expensive ink, and formaldehyde. We are in the private study of a renowned anatomist, a man of science who studies and catalogues human bodies.
His office is filled with precisely labeled diagrams, dried specimens, and heavy medical texts.
He is a man who defines his world by measurement and classification. This man, who spent his life studying the perfect blueprint of the body, has a young daughter named Elira. She has the gentle, distinct features of trisomy 21. Imagine the conflict in this room. The father, the man of pure science, looks at his daughter. His intellect sees the deviation, the statistical anomaly that he has recorded in his own textbooks.
His professional voice tells him she is a monster, a subject of curiosity, but his heart sees his daughter. He finds that his scientific tools are useless with her.
He cannot measure her love for music or her extraordinary ability to remember the names of all the flowers in their small courtyard. One evening, Elira is sitting at his massive oak desk.
She cannot read the complex Latin texts.
Instead, she is gently tracing the lines of a highly detailed, perfect anatomical diagram of the human heart, drawn by her father. Her father watches as she points to the diagram and quietly says, in her halting speech, "My heart is good, is full." The father, the great anatomist who has dissected 1,000 hearts, realizes that his entire life's work has missed the most essential measurement. He has measured the valves, the chambers, and the muscle tissue. But he has never recorded the capacity for affection. In that moment, the scientific gaze is overcome by the father's love. He closes the textbook, extinguishes the harsh oil lamp, and simply sits beside her, allowing the warmth of her hand on his to be the only data point that truly matters. This vignette captures the deep, quiet tension of the early modern period, the tragic inability of the emerging scientific mind to fully reconcile its new, cold categories with the enduring, ancient truth of the human heart. These small, intimate moments, the lesson in the garden, the silence in the king's court, the conflict in the anatomist's study, reveal that even in the darkest periods of history, when the law was silent or the diagnosis was cruel, the individual capacity for love and acceptance remained the most resilient force.
The quiet, enduring affection of these forgotten moments is our anchor as we continue to expand the story. Our task now is to enter the architecture of Eurasia, the massive, formidable institutions built during the height of the Victorian and eugenics eras.
We will not look at policy. We will look at stone, tile, and air. A building is never neutral. It is a philosophy rendered in brick.
These state schools and colonies were designed not to house people, but to manage populations.
Their architectural language spoke a single harsh word: control.
The outer shell, isolation, and scale. Imagine the initial moment of arrival at one of these enormous state schools like Fernald in Massachusetts or the former Willowbrook in New York in the year 1910. The institution is rarely near a town center.
It is always isolated, set back from the main road, surrounded by deep woods, or placed on a bleak, windswept hill. This geographical isolation was deliberate, designed to ensure that the public would never be reminded of the lives hidden within, thereby keeping the public conscience clear. The scale is overwhelming. The buildings are vast, symmetrical, and uniformly constructed of dark red brick or grey stone, often designed in a severe Italianate or neoclassical style, resembling a massive factory or government complex. The purpose of this scale was to instill on terror a constant, silent reminder that the individual was nothing and the state was everything.
Look closely at the windows. They are typically high and narrow, often barred. They are placed too high to allow a seated resident a view of the world outside, but high enough to let in the most basic, functional light.
They are designed to be viewed from the outside in, allowing staff to monitor without allowing the residents to look out. The windows became lenses of supervision, not openings to freedom.
The ground surrounding the main complex is often manicured but empty vast, echoing lawns where supervised, ritualized exercise takes place.
The only sound outside is the wind whistling through the empty space between the buildings.
The air itself feels heavy with official silence. 2. The auditory experience. The echo chamber step inside.
The moment the heavy oak doors close behind you, the soundscape shifts. The materials of the building were chosen for two properties: durability and ease of cleaning.
This means acoustics were sacrificed. The floors are covered in hard, institutional terrazzo or ceramic tile. The walls are hard plaster, often painted in antiseptic, non-committal green or beige.
There are no rugs, no curtains, no upholstered furniture, and nothing soft to absorb sound. The result is a devastating echo chamber. Listen to the sounds that define this world. The clanging of metal, the cafeteria tray dropping, the keys of the attendant jangling on a heavy ring.
The sound of the locking latch on the ward door. These metallic sounds become the perpetual, nerve-jangling soundtrack of custody. The slap of hard rubber soled shoes, the rapid, rhythmic pacing of attendants moving down the long corridors, signaling the imposition of structure and schedule, the dissonance of human voices, not the soft, modulated tones of conversation, but the shrill, desperate cries of those in distress, amplified and distorted by the empty space,
making communication exhausting and quiet comfort impossible. The overwhelming, institutional sound of running water, the constant, loud flush of toilets, the endless drone of shared showers, the roar of massive laundry machines.
The sounds of necessity are always present, always loud, and most devastating of all, the silence, the sound of emotional starvation.
In the crib wards, Part 12, where infants and young children were denied the sound of a loving voice or a lullaby, the silence itself became a tool of developmental arrest.
The only way to survive the cacophony was to retreat into a world of sensory stillness.
3.
The visual experience, the erasure of self. The sidescape of the institution was a masterclass in erasure of the individual. Color. The walls are relentlessly dull.
The choice of colors, the institutional green, the yellow and cream, the faded beige, was not for aesthetics, but for perceived cleanliness and to avoid stimulating the residents. There is no personal art, no bright, stimulating toys, and often no color at all, except for the harsh white glare of the overhead light fixtures.
Uniformity. Every element of life is standardized.
Residents with Down syndrome who in their home environments might have worn bright colors or cherished specific textures were forced into rough, standardized institutional clothing, often rough wool or cotton, designed not for comfort or fit, but for simple, durable washing.
The space. Day rooms are cavernous, filled with rigid, often bolted down wooden benches.
They are designed for easy hosing down, not for human comfort.
The beds in the dormitories are lined up in stark, military rows, separated by only a foot or two.
There is no space for privacy, no corner for retreat. The result is a continuous visual message. You do not matter.
Your individuality must be sacrificed to the order of the institution. The person with Down syndrome, who thrives on visual learning and personalized connection, was forced into a world that was entirely anti-developmental. 4.
The olfactory and tactile experience now. Let us consider the less visible, more immediate sensory assault. Smell and touch. The smellscape. The dominant smell is disinfectant, a constant, heavy chemical smell, often mixed with the institutional scent of lye, overcooked cabbage, and cheap soap.
The disinfectant was meant to signal cleanliness, but it masked the underlying pervasive odor of poor hygiene and sickness that defined the wards. This chemical-laden air was the backdrop to every waking moment. The touchscape. The lack of soft, comforting touch was perhaps the most damaging policy of all. The bedding was rough, scratchy cotton. The floors were cold tile or concrete. The furniture was hard, unforgiving wood. The human touch, the simple act of rocking, holding,
or gentle physical comfort, was often minimized by policy or simply neglected due to low staffing levels.
For individuals with Down syndrome, who often have sensory processing differences and a deep, innate need for physical connection, this lack of gentle, personalized touch caused profound emotional withdrawal and inhibited development. The absence of a loving hand became a physical manifestation of the institutional policy to detach and discard. The architectural language of the state school was a perfect reflection of the eugenics philosophy. Erase, control, contain. Every surface was hard, every sound echoed, every color was drained away.
The intention was to create an environment so cold that the spark of individuality, the very human spirit of the forgotten lives, would be extinguished by the weight of the design.
Yet, we know from the stories of the survivors that the human spirit is not so easily contained.
Within these cold, echoing walls, people still formed bonds, shared forbidden laughter, and communicated in their own quiet ways. The architecture failed in its final, cruel mission. The generation that survived the state schools, the forgotten lives who were finally returned to the world, carried the echoes of the asylum within them. They had to learn, as adults, the simplest rules of the outside world: how to choose their own clothes, how to cross a street, and how to trust a gentle touch. These are the stories of that difficult, beautiful re-entry. The sound of the radio. Helen's Discovery 1950 setting. A large multi-story state school dormitory, 1956. The echo. The sound is the constant clanging of metal and the loud, echoing footsteps of the night attendant.
Helen, a woman in her late 20s with trisomy 21, has lived in this single, sterile building since she was 3.
Her world is defined by the schedule: wake-up bell, harsh light, hard floor, uniform food.
She is one of the residents who retreats into a profound internal quiet to survive the sensory overload of the asylum Part 18.
She rarely speaks. Her language is minimal, stripped away by the lack of conversation and stimulation. One rainy Saturday afternoon, a young, idealistic student volunteer, defying the explicit rules of no personal property, sneaks a small, battery-operated transistor radio into the women's day room. Imagine the volunteer, a young woman named Sarah, sitting quietly with Helen. Sarah tentatively flicks the small switch.
The air, usually heavy with the chemical smell of disinfectant and the distant sound of institutional running water, is suddenly pierced by a new, vibrant sound: the smooth, melodic voice of a jazz singer floating out of the small plastic box. Helen freezes.
Her eyes, usually lowered, lift slowly. It is the first time in her life she has heard music that is not a military march or a simple, loud, religious hymn. It is music filled with rhythm, emotion, and nuance. She reaches out a small, tentative finger and gently touches the plastic grill of the radio speaker. She feels the vibration. The music is physically moving in her hand. Sarah smiles and whispers, "It's good, isn't it, Helen?"
It's happiness. In that moment, a profound memory resurfaces for Helen, a ghost of a lullaby her mother sang before the doors closed. The sound unlocks a word that hasn't been used in 20 years.
Helen's lips tremble slightly, and she whispers the word, soft and rhythmic: dance. The small act of defiance, the sound of the forbidden music, is the spark that begins to melt the hard shell of institutional trauma.
It proves that the human desire for rhythm and beauty was never extinguished, only dormant.
Helen, the quietest resident, begins to tap her foot, silently asserting her existence through the language of music. 2. The taste of freedom. David's first sandwich 1974 setting. The transition from a massive state facility in the American Midwest to a small, newly opened group home in the suburbs, 1974.
The echo. The institutional food.
For 20 years, David's diet has been uniform: bland, pureed, or overcooked sustenance designed for mass consumption. The smell of institutional coal smoke and cabbage had defined his meals. Part 18. David, now in his late 30s, is one of the first residents to be transferred in the initial wave of deinstitutionalitis. Part 14.
He is bewildered by the transition. The group home is too small, too colorful, and the sounds of ordinary life, a ticking wall clock, a washing machine humming, are terrifyingly loud to him.